The Winchester cracked like Judgment Day across Laramie's station platform. One moment, Silas Dunn had been pawing at the young telegraph operator's sleeve, whiskey fumes rolling off him like a fog. The next, he was sprawled in the dirt, blood blooming across his shoulder. William Brennan lowered his smoking rifle, his left hand missing 2 fingers steady on the forestock. The crowd at the station parted around him like the Red Sea before Moses. Will didn't speak. Didn't need to. His eyes, dark as Wyoming coal and just as unyielding, said everything necessary. "Obliged, Mr. Brennan." The telegraph operator stammered, gathering his scattered papers. Will nodded once. That was when he saw her standing apart from the other passengers, her carpet bag clutched in gloved hands. She wasn't pretty in the conventional sense. Her figure was full curves straining against the severe traveling dress, her auburn hair tucked beneath a practical bonnet. But it was her eyes that caught him, green as spring grass and utterly unflinching. She hadn't screamed or sought cover when the shooting started, just watched, calculating. "You'll want Doc Patterson for that one," Will told the station master, gesturing toward the groaning Dunn. "And tell Sheriff Tucker his deputy's been drinking on duty again." Will turned, intending to head back to his forge. He had a plow blade to finish before sundown when a commotion erupted near the newly arrived train. "This is fraud, pure and simple fraud," the voice carried like a gavel's strike. Will paused. The woman with the unflinching eyes was now surrounded by a small crowd. Facing her stood Harrison Caldwell himself, president of Laramie Western Bank and Union Pacific's man in Wyoming Territory. Caldwell was 45, but looked 35, his tailored suit and gold watch chain marking him as surely as a brand on cattle. "Sir, I don't understand." The woman began, her Boston accent evident, but her voice steady. Caldwell thrust a photograph toward her. This is what I received. A young woman of refined features and delicate build." His cold eyes raked over her. "Not someone of your dimensions." The crowd tittered. Someone muttered, "Mail-order bride," and snickered. Will should have walked away. None of his business how Caldwell conducted his affairs. The railroad baron had most of the county judge's bench in his pocket and owned enough land to make him dangerous. Smart men stayed clear of Harrison Caldwell's path. Will had never been accused of being particularly smart. "Problem here, Caldwell." He stepped forward, rifle cradled easily in the crook of his arm. Caldwell's expression flickered between surprise and annoyance. "Private matter, Brennan. The lady and I are discussing a contract." "Sounds more like you're publicly humiliating her." Will's voice remained level, but the edge was unmistakable. The woman's chin lifted. "I'm Margaret O'Sullivan, Mrs. Margaret O'Sullivan." The emphasis on her marital title was subtle but clear. "And I believe public humiliation exceeds the bounds of any contract." "Contract?" Will raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Caldwell advertised for a companion with educational and cultural refinements. I responded to that advertisement." She squared her shoulders. "The contract stated, a woman of good character and practical education. Nothing about appearance." "Good character." Caldwell laughed sharply. "A woman who deceives about something so fundamental has questionable character indeed." Will saw the flicker of hurt in Margaret's eyes, quickly masked. Something twisted in his gut. 5 years since Antietam, and still the sight of someone cornered and outnumbered stirred something primal in him. "Seems to me," Will said, stepping closer, "that a gentleman would discuss such matters privately." "Gentleman," Caldwell's lip curled. "Rich coming from Laramie's broken-handed blacksmith." His gaze flicked meaningfully to Will's damaged left hand. 5 years ago, Will would have put Caldwell on his back for less. Now he just smiled, cold as December steel. "I'm broken in places that matter less than some men's character." Caldwell flushed. "Sheriff Tucker," he called to the lawman hovering at the crowd's edge, "this woman has committed fraud. I want her arrested." Tucker, eternally eager to please the man who effectively owned Laramie, stepped forward, hand on his holstered Colt. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you'll need to come with—" "She's not going anywhere with you, Tucker." Will's rifle hadn't moved, but somehow everyone became acutely aware of its presence. "Now see here, Brennan," Tucker began. "Mrs. O'Sullivan came at my invitation." Will said, the lie falling from his lips before he'd fully formed the thought. "Any issue you can take up with me." Margaret O'Sullivan's eyes widened fractionally, but to her credit, she didn't contradict him. "Your invitation," Caldwell's eyebrows rose. "You expect us to believe that—" Will shrugged. "Believe what you want. Mrs. O'Sullivan is a friend of my late wife's family. I wrote asking if she might consider relocating to assist with bookkeeping for some of the local businesses." Another lie, but it sounded plausible enough. Will had a reputation for honesty that made even Caldwell hesitate. Caldwell stared hard at Will, then at Margaret. The calculation in his eyes was plain as daylight. Finally, he straightened his waistcoat with a sharp tug. "Very well. If you're claiming responsibility for this, woman, so be it." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure Judge Wilson will be interested to hear how you've started importing females under false pretenses." "Only false pretense I see is a man claiming to want refinement when he's really just shopping for ornaments." Will turned to Margaret. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, your trunk." She gestured to a modest case being unloaded from the baggage car. Will nodded to a boy loitering nearby. "Tommy, 2 bits to carry the lady's trunk to Mrs. Whitney's boarding house." The boy scampered off. Will offered his arm to Margaret, who took it after only the slightest hesitation. As they walked away from the platform, he felt Caldwell's eyes boring into his back like rifle sights. "You realize," Margaret murmured when they were out of earshot, "that you've just made a very powerful enemy." "Harrison Caldwell was my enemy long before today, Mrs. O'Sullivan." "Maggie," she said softly. "My friends call me Maggie." He glanced down at her. "We're not friends yet, Mrs. O'Sullivan." A faint smile touched her lips. "No, but you just lied to a sheriff and antagonized the richest man in the county on my behalf? It seems a promising start." Despite himself, Will felt an answering smile tug at his mouth. "I'm Will, William Brennan, the blacksmith with the broken hand, among other broken parts." He looked ahead as they turned onto Laramie's main street. "Why did you do it? Send a false picture?" She didn't pretend to misunderstand. "It wasn't entirely false. It was my younger sister's photograph. She died of consumption last winter." Maggie's voice remained steady. "I've discovered that a 32-year-old widow with no fortune has limited prospects in Boston society." "So you thought to try your luck in Wyoming?" "I thought to make a fresh start somewhere my past, and my appearance wouldn't matter so much." Her grip tightened slightly on his arm. "I didn't expect it to matter more." Will nodded toward a white clapboard house with green shutters at the street's end. "Mrs. Whitney's boarding house. She's a good woman. Doesn't gossip, doesn't judge. Her husband was the county's first land agent before the railroad came. And now she rents rooms and guards what's left of her husband's legacy from Harrison Caldwell's expansion." Maggie studied the house thoughtfully. "Mr. Brennan." Will, why did you intervene back there?" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. He saw nothing in her eyes but genuine curiosity. No artifice, no manipulation, just a direct question that deserved a direct answer. "5 years ago, I watched a man die at Antietam because no one would carry him off that field. Not his fault he was caught in the wrong place. Not his fault at all." Will's damaged hand flexed unconsciously. "I swore then I wouldn't walk past another person caught in a bad situation if I could help, even at personal cost. Especially then." Will began walking again. "Cost is what gives a choice meaning, Mrs. O'Sullivan." As they approached the boarding house, the door opened and Eleanor Whitney emerged, a tall, silver-haired woman with the straight posture of someone who'd never learned to bend to circumstances. "William Brennan," she called. "The telegraph office sent word you'd shot Silas Dunn and acquired a lady friend all in the space of 10 minutes. Even for you, that's efficient." Will doffed his hat. "Mrs. Whitney, may I present Mrs. Margaret O'Sullivan of Boston? She's in need of lodging." Eleanor's shrewd eyes took in Maggie's travel-worn appearance and the way she stood tired but dignified. "Any friend of Will's is welcome here, though friend might be stretching matters considering you've just met." Maggie's eyebrows rose. "News travels quickly in Laramie. Only the interesting kind," Eleanor said with a smile. "Come inside. I've just made coffee, and you look like you could use some." As they entered the boarding house, Tommy arrived puffing with Maggie's trunk. Will paid him the promised 2 bits, then paused at the threshold. "I should get back to the forge." Eleanor waved dismissively. "Nonsense. Join us for coffee. Mrs. O'Sullivan can tell us what brings a Boston widow all the way to our dusty corner of Wyoming." Will hesitated. The plow blade needed finishing, and he had 2 horseshoes promised to the stagecoach line by morning. But something in Maggie's expression, a flicker of apprehension quickly masked, decided him. Coffee would be welcome. Eleanor's parlor was modest but impeccably maintained. Photographs of her late husband Henry dominated the mantelpiece, a tall bearded man with kind eyes. Beside them stood a daguerreotype of a young soldier in Union blue. "Your son?" Maggie asked softly. Eleanor nodded. "Joseph, lost at Fredericksburg." "I'm sorry." "As am I. But he died believing in something larger than himself." Eleanor poured coffee into delicate china cups that seemed at odds with the frontier setting. "Now, Mrs. O'Sullivan, what brings you to our little outpost of civilization?" Will watched as Maggie's hands folded neatly in her lap. Decision time. Would she craft some elaborate lie, or tell the unflattering truth? "I came to marry Harrison Caldwell," she said simply. "A decision I'm now profoundly grateful didn't come to fruition." Eleanor nearly dropped her coffee cup. Harrison Caldwell, that acquisitive vulture. The advertisement spoke of a bank president seeking a cultured companion. It mentioned nothing of the man's character. Maggie's lips pressed together. "I sent a photograph, though not my own. My late sister's." "Why?" Eleanor asked bluntly. "Because I'd already been rejected by 3 potential employers in Boston for being too distracting to work in their offices." Maggie's voice remained even, but Will caught the underlying steel. "I needed to get my foot in the door. I thought once I arrived my skills would matter more than my appearance." "What skills might those be?" Will asked. "Bookkeeping. My father owned a small theater. I managed his accounts from the time I was 16 until I married at 23. Her eyes clouded briefly. "My husband preferred I not work. After he died in the factory fire last year, I discovered how thoroughly he'd mismanaged our finances." Eleanor studied her thoughtfully. "So you're educated, practical, and desperate. A common enough combination these days, especially for women." She set her cup down. "What will you do now?" "I still have sufficient funds for return passage to Boston, though what awaits me there?" Maggie shrugged. "Or I could stay and seek employment here, doing what Laramie isn't exactly overflowing with theaters, needing bookkeepers. Any business with accounts needs someone to keep them straight. Banks, mercantiles, shipping offices." Maggie's eyes flickered to Will. "Even blacksmiths, I'd imagine." Will nearly smiled. The woman had spirit, he'd grant her that. "Laramie has a bank," Eleanor said, "but, unfortunately, it's run by the very man you've already managed to offend." "Caldwell doesn't easily forgive perceived slights," Will added, "and he has influence with most businesses in town." Maggie absorbed this, her expression thoughtful, rather than defeated. "I see. Then perhaps private bookkeeping for ranchers or independent businesses or teaching. I've done that as well." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "We do need a teacher. The last one married a cattle baron from Montana and left us high and dry mid-term." Hope flickered in Maggie's eyes. I'm qualified. I taught at a girls' seminary for a year before my marriage. The school board would need to approve, Eleanor warned. And guess who chairs it? Caldwell, Will and Maggie said in unison. The man does cast a long shadow, Eleanor sighed. But he's not invincible. Henry used to say every man has a weakness. We just need to find Harrison's. His pride, Will said quietly. The man can't abide being publicly bested. Maggie considered this. Then perhaps the direct approach. I'll call on him tomorrow, apologize for the misunderstanding, and appeal to his better nature. Will and Eleanor exchanged glances. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Will said carefully, men like Harrison Caldwell don't have better natures. They have interests and advantages. If you approach him, it won't be forgiveness you'll receive. What then? A price, Eleanor said grimly. Everything with Harrison has a price. Maggie's shoulders squared. Then I'll find another way. She turned to Will. You mentioned I might assist with bookkeeping for local businesses. Was that merely a convenient fiction, or might there be actual opportunities? Will considered the half-finished ledgers in his forge office, the invoices he'd been meaning to reconcile for months. I could use help organizing my accounts, he admitted. It's not much, but it would be a start. I'll take it, Maggie said promptly. When can I begin? Tomorrow's Sunday, Eleanor interjected. Even William Brennan doesn't work on the Sabbath. You'll start Monday. She rose. Now I'll show you to your room. You must be exhausted after your journey. As Eleanor led Maggie upstairs, Will remained in the parlor staring into his coffee cup. What had he gotten himself into? One moment of chivalry, and now he was responsible for a Boston widow with dangerous curves and a talent for making powerful enemies. He glanced at the photograph of Joseph Whitney in his Union blue. The boy had been barely 20 when he marched off to war believing in justice and the Union. That same belief had cost Will Two Fingers countless friends, and sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, he feared it had cost him his soul as well. Eleanor returned, settling back into her chair with a sigh. Well, William, you've done it now. Done what exactly? Declared yourself. She lifted her cup, studying him over its rim. The moment you stepped between her and Caldwell, you made a choice that will have consequences. Will shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time. No, but it might be the most interesting. Eleanor set down her cup. That woman upstairs isn't some delicate flower needing protection. She has steel in her spine. I noticed. Did you also notice Harrison Caldwell's face when you claimed her as your guest? I haven't seen him that apoplectic since Henry refused to sell him the watershed rights to our eastern parcels. Will remembered all too well. Caldwell doesn't like losing. No, and he doesn't forget. You've made this personal. Eleanor leaned forward. Be careful, Will. The last man who publicly crossed Harrison ended up selling his ranch for pennies on the dollar after mysterious fires destroyed his outbuildings. You think I'm afraid of Harrison Caldwell, sir? I think you should be. Eleanor's eyes were serious. Not for yourself, perhaps, but what about your business? Your reputation? He has the ear of every influential man in the territory. Will stood, placing his empty cup on the side table. My reputation survived the war. It'll survive Harrison Caldwell. And Mrs. O'Sullivan, will she survive him too? That gave Will pause. She seems capable. Capable, yes, but familiar with frontier justice, with how quickly things can turn ugly out here. Eleanor shook her head. Boston hasn't prepared her for Wyoming's particular brand of ruthlessness. Then we'll have to ensure she learns quickly. Will reached for his hat. Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Whitney. I'll call for Mrs. O'Sullivan on Monday morning, 8 o'clock. Eleanor followed him to the door. William, she said quietly, why did you really step in today? And don't give me that Antietam story. I know you better than that. Will paused on the threshold, considering. There was a moment when Caldwell was dressing her down. She didn't cower, didn't weep or beg. just stood there with her chin up facing whatever was coming. He settled his hat on his head. Reminded me of someone. "Catherine?" Eleanor asked gently, naming his dead wife. "No," Will said. "Me." Will's forge sat at Laramie's edge, where the town surrendered to the vast Wyoming wilderness. The building was sturdy fieldstone with a timber roof, the chimney belching smoke visible from half a mile away. Behind it stood his cabin, small but solidly built, and a corral where his gelding Ulysses grazed contentedly. Inside the forge glowed orange in the gathering dusk, as Will hammered the plow blade into submission. Each strike sent sparks flying. Each impact traveled up his arm like artillery fire, familiar rhythmic pain that narrowed his world to metal and flame. He didn't hear the riders approach until Ulysses nickered a warning. Will set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow as he stepped outside. 3 men on horseback silhouetted against the setting sun. Will recognized Sheriff Tucker's distinctive slouch immediately. The other 2 took a moment longer, Judge Wilson's portly frame, and beside him, ramrod straight on a gleaming black stallion, Harrison Caldwell himself. "Evening, gentlemen," Will called, keeping his tone neutral. "What brings you out this way after business hours?" Tucker dismounted awkwardly, hitching his gun belt. "Official business, Brennan. On a Saturday night must be important." Judge Wilson eased himself down from his horse with a grunt. "Mr. Brennan, it has come to our attention that you may be operating outside the law." Will leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed. "That's so. Transportation of persons across state lines for immoral purposes is a federal offense," Caldwell said, remaining mounted and looking down at Will with undisguised contempt. "As is mail fraud." "Interesting legal discussion," Will replied evenly. "Not sure what it has to do with me." Tucker stepped forward. "The woman, Brennan, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Caldwell here says you arranged her passage from Boston." "I said no such thing. I said she came at my invitation. She arranged her own passage." "To marry another man using false representation," Caldwell cut in. "A crime you're now abetting." Will shrugged. "Mrs. O'Sullivan is a family friend seeking honest work in our community. Nothing criminal about that." "We'll see." Judge Wilson pulled a folded paper from his coat. "This is a warrant to search your premises for any correspondence with Mrs. O'Sullivan that might prove conspiracy to commit fraud." Will straightened his easy manner, vanishing. "You're not stepping foot in my home without better cause than Harrison Caldwell's wounded pride." Tucker's hand drifted to his holster. "Don't make this difficult, Brennan. I'm not the one making it difficult." Will's eyes hardened. "That warrant's not worth the paper it's written on. And you know it, Judge. No evidence, no probable cause, just Caldwell pulling your strings." Wilson flushed. "Now see here." "No, you see here." Will stepped forward, forcing Tucker to give ground. "Mrs. O'Sullivan made a mistake. She admitted it freely. There was no fraud committed because no transaction took place. She didn't take a penny from Caldwell." "She took train fare," Caldwell snapped. "I sent funds for her passage." "Then take it up with her," Will said. "But this show of force, this trumped-up warrant, it has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with your ego." Caldwell's face darkened. "You forget yourself, blacksmith, and you forget what country you're in." Will's voice was dangerously quiet now. "This isn't your private kingdom, Caldwell, no matter how many acres you buy or officials you own." Tucker's hand closed around his revolver. "That's enough, Brennan. You're coming with us." Will didn't move. "On what charge?" "Interfering with an officer in performance of his duties." "Last I checked, harassment wasn't an official duty." Will's eyes locked with Tucker's. "Draw that pistol, and you'd better be ready to use it." A tense silence fell. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Finally, Caldwell laughed, a cold, calculated sound. "Stand down, Sheriff. Mr. Brennan clearly isn't going to be reasonable tonight." He turned his horse. We'll settle this matter properly through legal channels. Legal channels, Will repeated flatly. Is that what we're calling your methods these days? Caldwell smiled thinly. You served in the war, didn't you, Brennan Union Cavalry, if I recall correctly? You know I did. Then you understand strategy. When a direct assault fails, one finds another approach. Caldwell tipped his hat. Good evening. As the three men rode away, Will remained in his doorway, the cooling forge at his back casting long shadows across the yard. Caldwell's parting words echoed in his mind. A threat plainly made, but against whom himself, or the woman he'd impulsively defended. Will closed his eyes briefly, remembering Maggie O'Sullivan's steady gaze, the way she'd stood her ground despite public humiliation. The quiet dignity in her voice when she'd said, I needed to get my foot in the door. He'd recognized something in her, then a survivor's determination, the kind forged in life's harshest fires. The same quality that had kept him alive through Antietam's The Bloodbath and the emptiness that followed. With a sigh, Will returned to his forge. The plow blade still needed finishing, and now more than ever he needed the mindless clarity of hammer and anvil. Tomorrow was soon enough to worry about Harrison Caldwell's next move. He worked late into the night, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal carrying across the sleeping town like a warning bell. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline Wyoming day that made even non-believers think twice about divine creation. Will attended church as he always did, not from any deep faith, but because Catherine had believed, and some habits died harder than others. He sat in his usual pew near the back, nodding to familiar faces while scanning for unfamiliar ones. He spotted Maggie almost immediately seated beside Eleanor Whitney near the front, her auburn hair caught in a simple twist, her dress modest but well-fitted. Several heads turned as the organ began, men's eyes lingering a beat too long on her profile. Pastor Miller's sermon centered on David and Goliath, the triumph of righteous courage over overwhelming odds. Will caught the old man's eyes flicking meaningfully toward him several times. News traveled fast in Laramie, and clearly yesterday's confrontation had already been woven into local mythology. After the service, Will waited in the churchyard, watching as Maggie and Eleanor navigated the crowd of well-wishers and curiosity-seekers. He noticed several of Laramie's merchants introducing themselves with particular enthusiasm. Eleanor had clearly been spreading the word about Maggie's bookkeeping skills. Mr. Brennan? Maggie approached, her cheeks flushed from the morning chill. Mrs. Whitney said you'd likely be here. Will touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I trust you slept well. Better than I expected, she admitted, though I understand I've become something of a local curiosity. Small towns, Will shrugged. Anything new is worth discussing twice, especially when it involves publicly defying Harrison Caldwell, Eleanor added, joining them. Half the congregation wanted details, the other half wanted to offer Maggie employment safely out of Caldwell's sight, of course. Will raised an eyebrow. Any promising offers? Several, Maggie said. Mr. Hargrove at the Mercantile, Mrs. Peterson, who runs the hotel, and Mr. Jenkins from the stage office. All respectable establishments, Eleanor noted, all conveniently located away from the bank. Maggie's smile was wry. Apparently my skills are in demand, provided I remain invisible to certain parties. Will was about to respond when he spotted Sheriff Tucker making his way through the dispersing congregation. Speaking of certain parties, Tucker reached them, nodding stiffly. Mrs. Whitney, Mrs. O'Sullivan. His eyes hardened when they reached Will. Brennan. Sheriff Teets, Will acknowledged. Church attendance isn't mandatory in Wyoming, last I checked. I'm here on official business. Tucker pulled a folded paper from his coat. For Mrs. O'Sullivan. Maggie accepted the document, her expression carefully neutral as she read it. I see. What is it? Eleanor demanded. A summons, Maggie said quietly. I'm to appear before Judge Wilson tomorrow morning, to answer charges of mail fraud and misrepresentation. Will's jaw tightened down. Caldwell works fast. The law works as needed, Tucker corrected. 10 o'clock, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Judge Wilson doesn't tolerate tardiness. As the sheriff walked away, Maggie refolded the summons with deliberate calm. Well, she said, it seems my Wyoming adventure will include a court appearance. This is outrageous. Eleanor fumed. Henry would never have allowed such abuse of legal process. Nevertheless, I must appear. Maggie turned to Will. I don't suppose you know any lawyers in Laramie. One, Will said grimly, Matthew Hayes, former Union Army legal counsel. Drinks too much, but knows the law cold. I'll take you to him this afternoon. Eleanor laid a comforting hand on Maggie's arm. Don't worry, my dear. Caldwell may own much of Laramie, but he doesn't own everyone. No, Will agreed, watching Tucker's retreating back. Not everyone. The afternoon found Will and Maggie in the cluttered office of Matthew Hayes, Esquire, above the barber shop on Pine Street. Hayes was 50, gray-haired and red-faced, with the perpetually moist look of a dedicated drinker. But his eyes were sharp as he reviewed the summons. Mail fraud preposterous. Hayes tossed the paper onto his desk. No money changed hands, no goods were delivered under false pretenses. At most, it's a civil matter of misrepresentation, and even that's tenuous. Can you represent me? Maggie asked. Hayes glanced at Will. Depends. Can she pay? I have some savings, Maggie began. Will cut her off. She can pay. Hayes studied them both, then nodded. $20. Half, now half when we win. Confident, Maggie observed. The law is clear, Mrs. O'Sullivan. This case is harassment pure and simple. Hayes leaned back in his creaking chair. The real question is why? Why would Harrison Caldwell, with all his resources and influence, pursue such a flimsy case? Pride, Will suggested. He was publicly embarrassed. Perhaps, Hayes drummed his fingers on the desk. Or perhaps there's something more. Mrs. O'Sullivan, what exactly did you tell Caldwell in your correspondence? Maggie considered. Very little, actually. He advertised for an educated woman with cultural refinements and bookkeeping experience. I responded with references from the girls' seminary where I taught, and my late husband's banker. You mentioned bookkeeping specifically. Yes, I detailed my experience managing my father's theater accounts and assisting with my husband's factory ledgers. Hayes and Will exchanged glances. Interesting, Hayes murmured. Very interesting. What is? Maggie looked between them. Will leaned forward. Harrison Caldwell's bank handles most of the payroll accounts for Union Pacific's western expansion. Thousands of dollars flow through his hands weekly. And no one audits those accounts, Hayes added. No one has the authority or expertise to challenge his bookkeeping. Maggie's eyes widened with understanding. You think he feared I might notice discrepancies? I think Harrison Caldwell doesn't want anyone with genuine bookkeeping expertise anywhere near his operations, Hayes said. Especially not someone who can't be intimidated or bought. Will watched Maggie absorb this, her expression shifting from confusion to thoughtful calculation. If that's true, she said slowly, then this court case isn't about wounded pride at all. It's about ensuring I leave Laramie as quickly as possible. Or establishing control over you, Will added grimly. A woman with a criminal conviction would have few options. Maggie's jaw set. Then we must win tomorrow. We will, Hayes assured her, reaching for a bottle in his desk drawer. The law is on our side. The law isn't always enough in Laramie, Will said quietly. Hayes poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. Then we'll need more than the law, won't we? As they left Hayes's office, Will noticed Maggie was unusually quiet. They walked several blocks before she spoke. If Mr. Hayes is right, if Caldwell truly fears financial scrutiny, Will glanced down at her. Then you've stumbled into something much bigger than a mail-order bride arrangement. Not stumbled, she corrected. Been led. The advertisement was very specific, seeking exactly my qualifications. Her green eyes met his. What if I wasn't selected by chance? What if someone wanted a skilled bookkeeper from outside Caldwell's sphere of influence to come to Laramie? Will stopped walking. That's a dangerous theory, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Maggie, she corrected absently, her mind clearly racing. My husband's banker wrote one of my references. Mr. Pierce was investigating the fire that destroyed Robert's factory. He never believed it was an accident. And 3 weeks after writing my reference, he sent me a telegram urging me to accept any position in Wyoming territory that might be offered. Her expression grew troubled. A week later, I read his obituary. Apparent suicide. Will felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wyoming air. You think he discovered something? Something connecting Robert's factory fire to Laramie, or to Harrison Caldwell, or to Union Pacific. Maggie's hands twisted nervously. What if I wasn't running from my past, but being sent directly toward it? Before Will could respond, hoofbeats pounded down the street. A rider pulled up sharply beside them, his horse lathered with exertion. "Brennan!" the man gasped. "Fire at your forge." Will's blood froze. "What?" "Started not 10 minutes ago. The whole place is going up." Will was running before the man finished speaking, Maggie lifting her skirts to follow. They rounded the corner onto Front Street, and Will stopped dead. His forge was engulfed in flames, black smoke billowing against the clear blue sky. Townspeople formed a bucket brigade from the nearby well, but it was clearly a losing battle. Even from here, Will could see the roof beginning to collapse. As they watched in horror, a second explosion rocked the building, sending sparks and debris flying. The crowd scattered, several men knocked from their feet by the blast. "Dear God," Maggie whispered. "What was that?" "Blasting powder," Will said numbly. "I keep a small supply for breaking stones." His fists clenched. This wasn't an accident. Sheriff Tucker pushed through the crowd, his face smudged with soot. "Stand back! Everyone, stand back!" Will surged forward, grabbing Tucker's arm. This was deliberate. Tucker shook him off. "You can't know that." "The forge was cold. I banked it properly before church." Will's voice was deadly quiet. "Someone did this." "Someone like who, Brennan?" Tucker demanded, but his eyes slid away too quickly. Will stared at the burning building that represented 5 years of grueling work. His livelihood, his independence. Everything gone, in minutes. "You know exactly who, Tucker." Across the street, Will spotted a familiar black stallion. Harrison Caldwell sat mounted, watching the conflagration with an expression of studied concern. As if feeling Will's gaze, he turned, meeting his eyes over the heads of the frantic crowd. Caldwell smiled, faintly tipped his hat, and rode away. Dawn broke hesitantly over Laramie, as if the sun itself was reluctant to illuminate the charred remains of Will Brennan's forge. Will stood among the ruins, boots crunching on ash-covered stone, the acrid smell of destruction thick in his nostrils. 5 years of work reduced to blackened timbers and twisted metal. He knelt, brushing aside debris to reveal his anvil cracked now from the intense heat, useless as a broken promise. His fingers traced the split in the metal, feeling the rough edge like an open wound. "Can it be salvaged?" Will didn't turn at Maggie's voice. He'd known she would come, even as Eleanor Whitney had tried to dissuade her. "No." He straightened, facing her. "Anvils don't break, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Not without help." Maggie stood at the edge of the ruins, her practical boots dusted with ash. A man's coat, presumably borrowed from Eleanor, wrapped around her against the morning chill. She looked different today, harder somehow, the softness of her curves belied by the steel in her eyes. "You still have your court appearance this morning," Will reminded her. "I'm aware." She picked her way carefully through the debris to stand beside him. "Mr. Hayes is meeting me at the courthouse at 9. I have time." Will studied her face. "Why are you here, Maggie?" She met his gaze directly. "Because this," she gestured at the destruction, "is because of me. Because you defended me." "No." Will's voice was firm. This is because of Harrison Caldwell. Because men like him believe they can burn and destroy anything that stands in their way. Then why aren't you afraid? The question caught him off guard. Who says I'm not? Your eyes. Maggie took a step closer. I've seen fear, Mr. Brennan. In my husband's eyes, when the factory burned. In my own everyday since. This isn't fear I'm seeing. Will looked away back to the broken anvil. What then? Calculation. The look of a man measuring distance before a leap. She touched his arm lightly. What are you planning to do? The simple contact, even through his coat sleeve, sent an unexpected jolt through Will. He'd grown unaccustomed to being touched, especially by a woman. He stepped back, regaining his composure. Planning. I'm planning to rebuild Mrs. O'Sullivan. That's what men do when life burns them down. We rebuild. And Harrison Caldwell, Will's expression hardened. A problem for another day. A problem that will still be here after my hearing. She glanced toward the town where the courthouse bell was beginning to toll the hour. Will you be there? Will hesitated. Court appearances meant crowds' attention, exactly what he'd spent 5 years avoiding. But the thought of Maggie facing Caldwell and Judge Wilson alone, I'll be there. Something like relief flickered across her face. Thank you. As she turned to go, Will called after her. Maggie, she paused, looking back. The truth, in court. Nothing but the truth, no matter how it reflects on you. She nodded once, understanding. The truth is all I have left, Mr. Brennan. He watched her walk away, back straight and head high, despite everything. Despite the ruins around them. Despite the forces aligned against her. Something stirred in Will's chest, an emotion he'd long thought buried beneath Antietam's blood-soaked soil. Admiration. Laramie's courthouse stood at the town's center, a 2-story brick building with pretensions of grandeur in its columned entrance and arched windows. By 9:30 it was packed to capacity, townsfolk jostling for seats to witness the morning's entertainment, the Boston Widow versus Harrison Caldwell. Will slipped in as Judge Wilson took the bench, finding a place against the back wall where he could observe without being observed. Maggie sat at the defendant's table beside Matthew Hayes, her green dress stark against the sea of darker colors. Across the aisle, Harrison Caldwell sat with his attorney James Prescott, imported from Cheyenne at considerable expense. Judge Wilson cleared his throat, bringing the murmuring crowd to silence. We are here to adjudicate the matter of Harrison Caldwell versus Margaret O'Sullivan on charges of mail fraud and misrepresentation. Mr. Prescott, you may proceed. Prescott rose, a tall, cadaverous man with the hungry look of a successful predator. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Mrs. O'Sullivan entered into correspondence with Mr. Caldwell under false pretenses, sending a photograph that was not her own with the intent to secure passage west at Mr. Caldwell's expense. He produced the photograph in question, a delicate-featured young woman with a shy smile, and the letters Maggie had written. As you can see, Your Honor, the deception is clear. Mr. Caldwell sent $30 in good faith for Mrs. O'Sullivan's passage, only to be greeted by a stranger bearing no resemblance to the woman he'd agreed to meet. Judge Wilson examined the photograph, then peered at Maggie over his spectacles. Indeed, the resemblance is minimal. Titters rippled through the courtroom. Will noticed Maggie's shoulders tighten, but her expression remained composed. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Wilson continued, how do you plead to these charges? Hayes rose before Maggie could speak. If I may, Your Honor, before my client enters a plea, I would like to clarify the actual legal standing of these charges. Wilson frowned. Proceed, but briefly. Thank you. Hayes pulled out a well-thumbed legal volume. Your Honor, the statutes regarding mail fraud require proof of intent to deprive the victim of property or money through deception. Mrs. O'Sullivan freely admits she sent a photograph that was not her current likeness. However, The critical element is whether this constituted fraud in the legal sense. Prescott interrupted. The woman clearly lied. The woman, Hayes said sharply, sent a photograph of her deceased sister, a fact she would have explained to Mr. Caldwell had he not chosen to publicly humiliate her instead. More importantly, Mrs. O'Sullivan made no false claims regarding her qualifications, which were the substantive basis of their arrangement. He held up Caldwell's original advertisement. Mr. Caldwell sought, and I quote, "a woman of refinement and education with experience in bookkeeping and social graces suitable to a man of standing." Mrs. O'Sullivan possesses all these qualifications. The photograph was incidental, not material, to the agreement. Judge Wilson drummed his fingers on the bench. "Mr. Prescott." Prescott adjusted his cravat. "Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell had a reasonable expectation that the photograph represented the woman with whom he was corresponding. The deception was deliberate and calculated." "Indeed." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps Mr. Caldwell would like to take the stand and testify to the material harm this deception caused him." A subtle shift rippled through the courtroom. Everyone knew taking the stand would subject Caldwell to cross-examination. He would have to answer questions under oath, questions about his motivations, his business practices, his interest in a woman with bookkeeping experience. Caldwell leaned forward, whispering urgently to Prescott. After a moment, Prescott straightened. "Your Honor." "Mr. Caldwell is a busy man. The $30 he spent on Mrs. O'Sullivan's passage is hardly worth the court's time. In the interest of judicial efficiency, we are prepared to drop the criminal charges if Mrs. O'Sullivan agrees to leave Laramie immediately and refund Mr. Caldwell's money." Hayes glanced at Maggie, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. "My client rejects this offer," Hayes announced. "Mrs. O'Sullivan has committed no crime and will not be run out of town like a common criminal. Furthermore, she has already secured employment in Laramie and intends to become a contributing member of this community." Murmurs swept through the courtroom. Judge Wilson banged his gavel. "Order!" Will watched Caldwell's face darken. This wasn't going according to his plan. A dismissal would leave Maggie free to stay in Laramie, free to examine books, free to ask questions about Union Pacific's finances. "Your Honor," Prescott tried again, "while we appreciate Mrs. O'Sullivan's ambitions, the fact remains that she arrived in Laramie under false pretenses. False pretenses don't constitute mail fraud without material harm," Hayes countered. "And since Mr. Caldwell is unwilling to testify under oath about this supposed harm." Judge Wilson held up his hand. "Enough! I've heard sufficient arguments." He fixed Maggie with a stern gaze. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, did you send a photograph that was not your own likeness?" Maggie rose, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom. "I did, Your Honor. It was my sister Clara's photograph. She died of consumption last winter." "And why did you do this?" Will saw Maggie straighten dignity in every line of her body. "Because I needed work, Your Honor, and I knew from bitter experience that my appearance often distracted from my qualifications. I wanted to be judged on my abilities, not my figure." A few chuckles sounded from the gallery, quickly silenced by Wilson's glare. "And the $30 Mr. Caldwell sent for your passage? I have it here, Your Honor." Maggie produced an envelope. "Untouched. I paid my own way to Laramie." Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Indeed, Mr. Prescott, your client claimed Mrs. O'Sullivan accepted his money for passage." Prescott shuffled his papers, clearly caught off guard. "Mr. Caldwell was led to believe—" "Your Honor," Maggie interrupted, "if I may." At Wilson's nod, she continued, "I never cashed Mr. Caldwell's bank draft. I kept it as evidence that I had not used his money should questions arise." She handed the envelope to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. Wilson examined the bank draft, then looked sharply at Prescott. "This draft is still made out to Mrs. O'Sullivan. It was never cashed." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Will felt a smile tugging at his lips. Maggie O'Sullivan was proving to be far more than Harrison Caldwell had bargained for. Judge Wilson banged his gavel again. In light of this evidence, I find no basis for charges of mail fraud. Case dismissed. He peered at Maggie. However, Mrs. O'Sullivan, let this be a lesson in frontier forthrightness. In Wyoming, we value honest dealing. I trust your future endeavors in our community will reflect this principle. They will, Your Honor, Maggie promised. As the crowd began to disperse, Will caught Caldwell's eye across the room. The banker's expression was controlled, but Will recognized the cold fury beneath the surface. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Will made his way to Hayes and Maggie, who were accepting congratulations from several townspeople. "A fine showing, Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said when he reached them. Maggie's smile was tired but triumphant. "Thank you for coming." "Wouldn't have missed it," Will replied honestly. "You just handed Harrison Caldwell his first public defeat in years." Hayes snorted. "And he won't forget it. You should watch your back, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Caldwell doesn't take kindly to losing." "I'm aware." Maggie's expression sobered as she looked at Will. "As Mr. Brennan can attest." Will nodded grimly. "Speaking of which, I should return to what's left of my forge. There's salvage work to be done." "I'll help," Maggie said immediately. Will blinked in surprise. "It's dirty work, Mrs. O'Sullivan, not suitable for a woman?" She arched an eyebrow. "Mr. Brennan, I grew up in a theater. I've swept stages, moved scenery, and mended costumes in conditions that would make your forge look positively pristine. Besides," she added, her voice dropping, "I believe we have matters to discuss." Will couldn't argue with that. Whatever Caldwell's next move might be, they needed to be prepared. "Very well. Meet me there in an hour." True to her word, Maggie arrived at the forge ruins precisely an hour later, having changed from her court dress into a practical work skirt and blouse. She'd even brought gloves, men's work gloves, borrowed from Eleanor's late husband's things. "Where do we start?" she asked, surveying the destruction. Will had already begun sorting through the debris, separating salvageable tools from ruined ones. "Metal first," he said, pointing to a pile of blackened implements. "Most of it can be cleaned and reused. The structure itself—" He shook his head. "That's another matter." They worked in companionable silence for a time, Maggie proving surprisingly strong and capable. Will found himself revising his initial assessment of her with each passing hour. Boston widow she might be, but there was nothing fragile about Margaret O'Sullivan. "You mentioned your husband's factory fire," Will said as they paused to drink water from a canteen. "What kind of factory was it?" Maggie wiped her brow, leaving a streak of soot across her forehead. "Textile machinery. Robert's family had been in the business for generations. They manufactured looms, primarily. Competitors, several, but Robert's designs were considered superior." Pride briefly animated her features. He had a gift for mechanical innovation. Will handed her a cloth to wipe her face, and the fire. Maggie's expression darkened. Official ruling was faulty wiring. Robert had recently installed electric lights in the workshop, one of the first factories in Boston to do so. She shook her head. "But Mr. Pierce, our banker, never believed it. He was investigating insurance claims on several similar fires when he suggested you come to Wyoming," Will finished, "and then conveniently committed suicide." "Yes." Maggie met his eyes. "Mr. Brennan, what do you know about Harrison Caldwell?" Will considered his answer carefully. "He came to Laramie 5 years ago, just after the war. Union Pacific was expanding west, and suddenly this well-dressed Easterner appears with enough capital to buy the only bank in town. Within a year, he controlled most of the commercial property on Main Street, and his connection to Union Pacific. Officially, he handles their payroll accounts and land acquisitions in Wyoming territory." Will's expression hardened. "Unofficially, he's their enforcer. When Union Pacific wants land, Caldwell finds a way to acquire it, foreclosure, legal pressure, or more direct methods like what happened here. He gestured at the burned forge. Maggie absorbed this, her clever eyes narrowed in thought. And before Laramie, where did he come from? Boston originally, according to town gossip, made his first fortune in manufacturing during the war. Will watched her reaction closely. Textile machinery specifically. Maggie went very still. What was his company called? Caldwell & Sons Industrial Equipment. The color drained from Maggie's face. Robert's main competitor? The company that always bid just below us for government contracts always seemed to know our designs before we unveiled them. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The company that offered to buy Robert out a month before the fire. Will nodded grimly. And now he's here running a bank that handles millions in railroad money in a town where no one has the expertise to check his books. No one until now, Maggie said softly. Until now, Will agreed. Which is why he was so eager to get rid of you. They stared at each other, the implications hanging in the air between them. It wasn't just about a mail-order bride arrangement gone wrong. It wasn't even about Will's defiance. This was about money, railroad money, and the lengths to which a man like Caldwell would go to protect his access to it. What do we do? Maggie asked finally. Before Will could answer, hoofbeats approached. They turned to see Sheriff Tucker riding toward them, accompanied by 2 deputies. Brennan, Tucker called, reining in his horse. Got a warrant here for your arrest. Will tensed. On what charge? Arson. Tucker dismounted, hand resting on his holster. Witnesses saw you near Hargrove's Mercantile last night around midnight. Fire broke out in the storeroom an hour later. That's impossible. Maggie stepped forward. Mr. Brennan was... Mrs. O'Sullivan will cut her off with a warning look. Sheriff Tucker, I was at my cabin all night. After losing my forge, the last thing I'd do is burn down Arthur Hargrove's store. He's been a friend for years. Tell it to the judge, Tucker said, producing handcuffs. You're coming with us. Will knew resistance would only make things worse. He held out his hands, allowing Tucker to cuff him. This is Caldwell's doing, he said quietly to Maggie. He's removing obstacles. Tucker shoved him roughly toward a waiting horse. No talking, Brennan. Maggie stood frozen, watching as the deputies mounted their horses. What can I do? She called to Will. Will met her eyes one last time. Find Eleanor Whitney. Tell her it's time to open Henry's box. As Tucker and his men rode away with Will, Maggie remained among the forge ruins, ash swirling around her skirts like ghostly messengers. Her mind raced with connections forming between Boston and Laramie, between Robert's death and Will's arrest, between her arrival and the sudden acceleration of events. Harrison Caldwell was eliminating threats systematically and ruthlessly. First Will's forge, now a false arrest. What would be next? With renewed determination, Maggie gathered her things and headed back toward town. Whatever was in Henry Whitney's box, she intended to find it before Caldwell's next move. Eleanor Whitney's face hardened when Maggie delivered Will's message. Without a word, the older woman led her to the parlor, locked the door, and pulled a small key from around her neck. Henry knew this day might come, she said quietly, moving to a portrait of her late husband. She swung it aside, revealing a small wall safe. He left instructions that this box was to be opened only if Harrison Caldwell ever showed his true nature. The safe door swung open, and Eleanor withdrew a metal lockbox, its surface etched with the initials H.W. She set it on the table and inserted the key. My husband was Laramie's first land agent, she explained as she opened the box. Every property transaction in the county passed through his hands, every deed, every sale, every mineral right. She met Maggie's eyes, including the original Union Pacific land grants. Inside the box lay a leather-bound ledger and a stack of documents tied with faded ribbon. Eleanor removed the ledger, first handling it as reverently as a Bible. Henry kept 2 sets of records, she said, opening the book to reveal columns of neat handwriting. The official records which everyone could see, and this his private account of what really happened. Maggie leaned forward, her bookkeeper's eye immediately drawn to the numbers. These are land valuations, she murmured, tracing the columns. "But there are two figures for each property, the true value and the recorded value," Eleanor confirmed. "The difference went into certain pockets to ensure the railroad got what it wanted. Bribes. Henry called them expediting fees. But yes, bribes." Eleanor turned several pages. "It was common practice when the railroad came through. Henry participated because he had no choice until he discovered the second layer." Second layer. Eleanor pointed to a section marked Special Acquisitions. These properties were purchased at artificially low prices, foreclosed upon using manipulated loans, or seized through other means. Their titles were then transferred to a holding company based in Boston. "Caldwell and Sons," Maggie breathed, seeing the name repeated throughout the entries. "Exactly. Harrison Caldwell wasn't just Union Pacific's agent. He was using his position to build his own empire alongside the railroad's expansion." Eleanor's finger traced down to a final entry dated just before her husband's death. Henry discovered that Caldwell was skimming from the payroll accounts as well, recording higher wages than were actually paid, and pocketing the difference. Maggie quickly calculated the amounts. "This is thousands of dollars every month, multiplied across every railroad work camp from Cheyenne to Salt Lake City." Eleanor closed the ledger. Henry confronted Caldwell privately, thinking they could resolve it quietly. "A week later, my husband was dead. Heart failure, according to the doctor Caldwell brought in from Cheyenne. You believe he was murdered?" It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway. "I know it, but I could never prove it. After Henry died, Caldwell consolidated his power. Judge Wilson, Sheriff Tucker, even Pastor Miller, they all owe him in one way or another. And the evidence in this box, useless without someone who understands the numbers well enough to testify to their meaning. Someone beyond Caldwell's influence." Eleanor gave Maggie a pointed look. "Someone like you." Maggie felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "That's why Will was arrested. Caldwell knows about this box. He suspects, at least. Will helped me hide it after Henry died." Eleanor began gathering the documents. "We need to get these to Matthew Hayes immediately. He's the only lawyer in town Caldwell hasn't bought. And Will, he's innocent of the arson charge. Innocence rarely matters when Harrison Caldwell wants someone eliminated," Eleanor said grimly. "But these documents might be enough to force Judge Wilson to reconsider, especially if we can connect them to Will's false arrest." As Eleanor rewrapped the documents, a knock sounded at the front door. Both women froze. "Were you followed?" Eleanor whispered. "I don't think so," Maggie replied, but uncertainty gnawed at her. Caldwell seemed to have eyes everywhere in Laramie. Eleanor hastily returned the ledger to the lockbox. "Take it," she urged, pressing it into Maggie's hands. "Go out the back way through the kitchen. Get to Hayes. I'll handle whoever's at the door." Maggie hesitated. "What about you?" "I'm an old woman with powerful friends in the territorial capital," Eleanor said with grim humor. "Even Caldwell has limits to what he can do publicly." Another knock, more insistent this time. "Go," Eleanor insisted. "Will's life depends on it." Maggie tucked the lockbox under her arm and slipped toward the kitchen as Eleanor moved to answer the door. Through the crack in the parlor door, she saw Eleanor open the front door to reveal Sheriff Tucker, flanked by two deputies. "Mrs. Whitney," Tucker said, removing his hat with false politeness, "I have a warrant to search these premises for evidence related to the Hargrove mercantile fire." "On what grounds?" Eleanor demanded. "Information that William Brennan may have stored incendiary materials here." Tucker stepped forward. "Please step aside, ma'am." As the men pushed past Eleanor, Maggie slipped through the kitchen and out the back door. The lockbox clutched tightly against her chest. She had to reach Hayes before Tucker finished searching the boarding house and realized she was gone. Keeping to back alleys, Maggie moved swiftly through Laramie's afternoon shadows. The weight of Henry Whitney's evidence seemed to grow heavier with each step. This wasn't just about clearing Will's name now. This was about exposing corruption that reached from Wyoming all the way back to Boston, corruption that had likely cost her husband his life. She was so focused on her destination that she didn't notice the figure stepping from a doorway until he blocked her path. James Prescott Caldwell's attorney stood before her, flanked by two men she didn't recognize. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Prescott smiled thinly. Mr. Caldwell would like a word. Maggie backed away, clutching the lockbox tighter. I have nothing to say to Mr. Caldwell. On the contrary, Prescott nodded toward the box. I believe you have a great deal to discuss, specifically the contents of Henry Whitney's private records. Cold fear washed through Maggie. How could they know unless— Eleanor, she whispered, is currently explaining to Sheriff Tucker why she's been harboring evidence pertinent to an ongoing investigation. Prescott stepped closer. The question now, Mrs. O'Sullivan, is whether you'll be joining Mr. Brennan in a cell or whether you might be persuaded to take a more cooperative approach. Cooperative? Mr. Caldwell is a reasonable man. He understands you were manipulated by Will Brennan and Eleanor Whitney, drawn into their vendetta against him. Prescott gestured to the waiting carriage behind him. He's prepared to overlook your involvement, provided you turn over that box and agree to leave Laramie on tomorrow morning's eastbound train. Maggie considered her options. The alley was deserted, Hayes's office still 3 blocks away. She couldn't outrun Prescott's men, not in a skirt, and carrying the heavy box. And if I refuse? Prescott's smile vanished. Then Sheriff Tucker will have another cell to fill. Accessory to arson carries a significant sentence in Wyoming territory. Maggie straightened her spine, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. I think I'll take my chances with the justice system, Mr. Prescott, corrupt as it may be. A poor choice, Mrs. O'Sullivan, Prescott nodded to his companions. Take her, and the box. As the men advanced, a shot rang out, echoing between the buildings. One of Prescott's men cried out, clutching his arm, as blood blossomed across his sleeve. I wouldn't, came a familiar voice. Maggie turned to see Frank Donovan, the Chicago Tribune reporter who'd been staying at Eleanor's boarding house, aiming a revolver with steady precision. Behind him stood Arthur Hargrove, the mercantile owner whose store had allegedly been burned by Will. Mr. Donovan, Prescott began, this doesn't concern the press. On the contrary, Donovan replied cheerfully, corruption in Union Pacific's land acquisition practices is exactly what brought me to Wyoming. He gestured with his pistol. Step away from Mrs. O'Sullivan, gentlemen, or the next bullet finds a more vital target. Prescott hesitated, calculating his odds. Finally, he stepped back. This isn't over, he warned Maggie. Mr. Caldwell has resources beyond your imagination. So do we, Hargrove said grimly. The telegraph office just received word from the territorial governor. He's sending investigators to review Judge Wilson's recent cases, including the suspicious number of land foreclosures benefiting Union Pacific. Donovan kept his pistol trained on Prescott as Maggie moved to join him and Hargrove. Fascinating timing, he remarked, almost as if someone had been sending evidence to the governor for weeks. Eleanor, Maggie realized, she's been building a case. With help, Hargrove acknowledged. Not everyone in Laramie is blind to what Caldwell's been doing. Some of us have just been waiting for the right moment to act. Prescott's face had gone pale. You're making a grave mistake, all of you. Caldwell won't do anything, Donovan interrupted, because as we speak, federal marshals are examining his bank's records. It seems Union Pacific's board of directors is quite interested in where their payroll funds have been disappearing to. As the implications sank in, Prescott's composure finally cracked. I need to speak with my client, he muttered, backing away. This isn't over. No, Maggie agreed, clutching Henry Whitney's box of evidence. It's just beginning. As Prescott and his men retreated, Maggie turned to her unexpected saviors. Thank you, but how did you know? Eleanor sent word through her kitchen girl, Hargrove explained. We've had a network in place since Henry died, waiting for the evidence we needed to move against Caldwell. And now we have it, Donovan added, nodding to the box. But we need to move quickly. Caldwell will be destroying evidence as we speak. What about Will? Maggie asked urgently. He's innocent of the arson charges. Of course he is, Hargrove snorted. My store never burned. That was a ruse to get Brennan into custody where Caldwell could eliminate him quietly. Horror washed through Maggie. Then we have to get to the jail immediately. Already taken care of, Donovan assured her. Judge Wilson's clerk is a member of our little resistance. He's preparing release papers as we speak. But first, Hargrove said grimly, we need to secure that evidence. Caldwell still has men throughout town, and they'll be looking for you. Maggie clutched the box tighter. Where can we go? Donovan smiled. Somewhere Caldwell would never think to look. The last place in Laramie he'd expect to find rebellion. Where's that? His own house, Hargrove said with grim satisfaction. Or more specifically, the tunnels beneath it, built by the previous owner, Henry Whitney himself. As they hurried through Laramie's back streets, Maggie felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The truth about Robert's death, about the corruption connecting Boston to Wyoming, was finally coming to light. But Caldwell was cornered now, and like any predator, he would be at his most dangerous. What would he do when he realized his carefully constructed empire was crumbling? And more urgently, what was happening to Will Brennan in that jail cell while they scrambled to save him? Will Brennan had known many cells in his lifetime prisoner of war camps, during the conflict drunk tanks as a lawman, and once a night in a Cheyenne jail after a misunderstanding with a cattle baron's son. But Laramie's jail had a different quality. The stone walls sweated with malevolence, as if absorbing the corruption of those who ran it. He sat on the narrow cot, back against the wall, watching Sheriff Tucker through half-lidded eyes. Tucker was nervous, pacing the small office beyond the cells, checking his pocket watch every few minutes. Expecting company, Sheriff? Will asked, his voice deliberately casual. Tucker jumped. Shut your mouth, Brennan. Strange thing about Hargrove's store. Will continued as if Tucker hadn't spoken. It's made of brick. Brick doesn't burn easy. Fire's fire, Tucker muttered, but his eyes slid away. And Arthur Hargrove is a friend. Known him 15 years, since before the war. Odd that I'd suddenly decide to burn down his livelihood. Tucker's hand drifted to his holster, a nervous tell Will had noticed years ago. Evidence says otherwise. What evidence? Will leaned forward. There was no fire, was there, Tucker? It's just a convenient way to lock me up, while Caldwell deals with Mrs. O'Sullivan and whatever she and Eleanor Whitney found in Henry's box. The sheriff's head snapped up. What box? What are you talking about? Will smiled thinly. Too late, Tucker realized he'd revealed something. The story about Hargrove's store was indeed a fabrication, which meant the arrest was purely about keeping Will contained. How much did he pay you, son? Will asked quietly. What's the price of a lawman's honor these days? Tucker's face flushed. You think you're so righteous, Brennan. Where was your righteousness when Union soldiers were burning Southern farms, when your regiment executed prisoners at Cold Harbor? Will's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his stomach. Those weren't executions. They were mercy killings for men who would have died slow otherwise. Tell that to their families. Tucker spat on the floor. You judge me for taking Caldwell's money, but at least I never played God with men's lives. Will absorbed the blow silently. The war had left scars on everyone, visible or not. He'd made peace with his actions at Cold Harbor years ago, but hearing them thrown back at him still stung. We all have blood on our hands, Tucker, he said finally. Difference is, I'm not adding to mine by helping Caldwell destroy this town. Destroy. Tucker laughed harshly. Look around you, Brennan. Laramie was nothing before Harrison Caldwell. A dusty way station with a few ranches. Now we have a bank, a hotel a proper courthouse. The railroad brings goods from back east. Children get educated. All because of Caldwell and Union Pacific. At what cost? How many families displaced? How much land stolen? How many men like Henry Whitney silenced? Will leaned forward. The railroad would have come with or without Caldwell. Progress was inevitable. The corruption wasn't. Tucker turned away. Save your sermons. You'll be facing Judge Wilson tomorrow morning. After that, he shrugged. Accidents happen in prison wagons. The threat hung in the air between them. Will had no illusions about his chances if he remained in custody. Caldwell wouldn't risk him reaching Cheyenne and testifying before authorities beyond his control. Tucker, Will said softly, whatever Caldwell's paying you, it won't be enough when this is over. Men like him always need scapegoats. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across Tucker's face. Then the jailhouse door banged open, and two deputies entered, half-dragging a struggling woman between them. Got her, Sheriff, one called. Caught her trying to leave town. Eleanor Whitney's silver hair had come loose from its pins, and a bruise was forming on her cheek, but her eyes blazed with defiance. She straightened as much as the deputy's grip allowed, spotting Will in his cell. William, she acknowledged with remarkable composure. I see Caldwell's hospitality extends to you as well. Mrs. Whitney, Will replied, taking in her disheveled appearance with mounting concern. Are you hurt? Nothing but my dignity, she assured him, then turned to Tucker. Sheriff, I demand to know on what charges you're detaining me. Tucker consulted a paper on his desk. Obstruction of justice, harboring evidence pertinent to an investigation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He looked up. Judge Wilson signed the warrant himself. How convenient, Eleanor said dryly. And what investigation might I be obstructing? The arson at Hargrove's store. Eleanor's eyebrow arched. Arthur Hargrove's store is perfectly intact. I passed it not an hour ago. Tucker flushed. The attempted arson, then. Attempted by whom, Mr. Brennan, who you've conveniently imprisoned? Eleanor shook her head. Even for Laramie, this charade is remarkably transparent. Put her in the cell, Tucker ordered the deputies, and search the boarding house again. The box must be there somewhere. As the deputies unlocked the cell beside Will's, he caught Eleanor's eye. A question passed silently between them. The box. Eleanor's slight nod confirmed what Will hoped Maggie had escaped with Henry Whitney's evidence. But where was she now? And who else might be helping her? Once the deputies had locked Eleanor in and departed, Will moved to the bars separating their cells. Are you really all right? He asked quietly. I've endured worse, Eleanor replied, straightening her disheveled clothing. Though I must say, Harrison's thugs lacked the gentle touch Henry always credited to proper Wyoming men. Maggie! Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. Got away with the box. Donovan and Hargrove intercepted her before Prescott could take her. They're moving to the tunnels. Relief washed through Will. Good. How many others are involved? Enough. Henry's network has been waiting for this moment for 3 years. Eleanor settled on her cot, arranging her skirts. The governor's men should arrive by morning, but that may be too late for us, Will finished. Tucker's threat about accidents in prison wagons echoed in his mind. Eleanor nodded grimly. Harrison knows he's cornered. The wire from the governor Maggie's escape with the evidence, he'll act quickly now. How quickly? As if in answer, the jailhouse door opened again. Harrison Caldwell himself entered impeccably dressed, as always, not a hair out of place, despite the day's chaos. Behind him came 2 men Will didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers with the dead eyes of hired killers. Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Whitney. Caldwell nodded as if greeting them at a social function. I trust you're finding the accommodations adequate. Get to the point, Caldwell, Will said. We both know why you're here. Caldwell smiled thinly. Direct as always? Very well. He turned to Tucker. Sheriff, I'll need to transfer these prisoners immediately. Judge Wilson has authorized their movement to Cheyenne for further questioning. Tucker frowned. At night, the prison wagon won't arrive until morning. My men have a suitable conveyance. Caldwell gestured to his companions. Given the sensitivity of the situation and the connections these individuals have in Laramie, it seems prudent to remove them sooner rather than later. Will and Eleanor exchanged glances. This was it, Caldwell's move to eliminate them before the governor's investigators arrived. Tucker hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I don't know, Mr. Caldwell. Procedure says. Procedure, Caldwell cut him off, is a luxury for peaceful times, Sheriff. We have a conspiracy threatening the very foundation of Laramie's prosperity. Surely, you don't wish to be remembered as the man who allowed sentiment to override security. The threat was thinly veiled. Tucker swallowed hard, then nodded. I'll need the judge's written authorization. Of course. Caldwell produced a folded document from his coat. Signed and sealed not an hour ago. As Tucker reviewed the paper, Will caught Eleanor's eye again. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Whatever happened next, they were ready. Seems in order, Tucker said, finally reaching for his keys. But I'll need to accompany the prisoners. Regulations. That won't be necessary, Caldwell said smoothly. My men have full authority from the territorial marshal. You're needed here in case Mrs. O'Sullivan attempts to make contact. Tucker's eyes narrowed slightly, the first sign Will had seen that the sheriff might be reconsidering his allegiance. Marshal Collins authorized this. That's unusual. These are unusual times. Caldwell's patience was clearly wearing thin. The keys, Sheriff. After another moment's hesitation, Tucker handed over the cell keys. I'll need a receipt for the prisoners. Naturally, Caldwell passed the keys to one of his men. Mr. Brennan first. He's the more physical threat. The hired gun approached Will's cell key extended. Will stood calmly, hands at his sides, waiting. As the key turned in the lock, he locked eyes with Caldwell. You won't get away with this, Will said quietly. Too many people know now. Know what? Caldwell's smile was reptilian. That a disgraced former lawman with a history of violence burned down a store and then resisted arrest? That a grief-addled widow spread malicious rumors about a respected businessman? The story writes itself, Mr. Brennan. And Eleanor, what's her crime, being Henry's widow? Something flickered in Caldwell's eyes at the mention of Henry Whitney. Mrs. Whitney has harbored dangerous elements and obstructed justice. Her advanced age will be taken into consideration at sentencing, I'm sure. The cell door swung open. The gunman entered, manacles ready. Turn around, he ordered Will. Hands behind your back. Will complied, but as the man leaned forward to apply the cuffs, Will made his move. Years of combat had taught him economy of motion, no wasted energy, no telegraphed intentions. His elbow connected with the gunman's throat in a sharp jab, cutting off both air and sound. As the man crumpled, Will caught the falling keys and manacles with his damaged left hand. The second gunman reached for his holstered weapon, but Will was already moving. He flung the heavy manacles with precision, striking the man's hand just as he cleared leather. The gun discharged into the floorboards as Will lunged through the cell door. Tucker scrambled for his own weapon, but he was too slow. Will's fist connected with his jaw in a solid hook, sending the sheriff sprawling across his desk. That left Caldwell. The banker backed away, hands raised. Now, Brennan, think about what you're doing. Assaulting an officer resisting arrest, you're only making things worse. Worse than being murdered on the way to Cheyenne. Will moved toward Eleanor's cell keys in hand. I don't think so. As he unlocked her door, shouts erupted from outside the jailhouse. Hoofbeats pounded down the street, and multiple voices called orders. Too late, Caldwell, Will said, helping Eleanor to her feet. Sounds like the governor's men have arrived early. Caldwell's expression shifted from confidence to calculation. This isn't over, Brennan. You have no idea the forces aligned against you. Maybe not, Will acknowledged, but I know which side I'm on. Do you? He gestured to the fallen gunmen and the groaning sheriff. These men were willing to kill for you. Are you willing to face justice for them? The jailhouse door burst open, but instead of the governor's investigators, Silas Morgan strode in, the man Will had recognized from the stagecoach robbery that killed his son. Behind him came 4 more hired guns, all with weapons drawn. "Problem, Mr. Caldwell?" Morgan asked, his cold eyes taking in the scene. "A minor setback," Caldwell replied. "Mr. Brennan seems reluctant to accept our hospitality. Perhaps you could persuade him." Morgan's thin lips curved in a smile that never reached his eyes. "With pleasure." Will positioned himself in front of Eleanor, assessing his options. The odds had just shifted dramatically out of his favor. 5 armed men and he with only his bare hands. "Run," he murmured to Eleanor. "First chance you get, run." "I'm too old to run, William," she replied calmly. "But I'm not too old to fight." Before Will could respond, another commotion erupted outside, louder this time, with the distinctive sound of multiple horses and men shouting orders. Morgan turned toward the door, frowning. "What now?" The answer came in the form of Arthur Hargrove, who stepped into the jailhouse with a double-barreled shotgun leveled at Morgan's chest. Behind him streamed a dozen men, ranchers, shopkeepers, and farmers Will recognized from around Laramie. "Evening, gentlemen," Hargrove said pleasantly. "Having a private party." Morgan's hand twitched toward his holster, but Hargrove's shotgun never wavered. "Wouldn't," Hargrove advised. "Not unless you want to be cleaning your insides off the wall." "What is the meaning of this?" Caldwell demanded, his composure finally cracking. "Hargrove, you're interfering with official law enforcement." "Am I?" Hargrove raised an eyebrow. "Funny, because I just came from my burned-down store where I was meeting with actual law enforcement, specifically Deputy Marshal Jenkins from Cheyenne and 2 territorial investigators." His eyes narrowed. "They're very interested in these fraudulent arrest warrants and Judge Wilson's unusual late-night authorization for prisoner transfer." Caldwell paled. "You have no authority." "But I do," came a new voice. Frank Donovan stepped into the jailhouse, followed by a tall man wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge. "Marshal Collins, may I present Harrison Caldwell and his associates currently in the process of attempting an illegal prisoner extraction." Marshal Collins surveyed the scene with professional detachment. "Mr. Caldwell," he nodded. "I've been hearing some concerning reports about judicial irregularities in Laramie." His gaze fell on the document in Tucker's hand. "Including unauthorized use of my name, it seems." Caldwell's confident facade finally shattered. "This is absurd. I am a respected businessman." "You're a thief and a murderer," came a clear female voice from the doorway. Maggie O'Sullivan stepped into the jailhouse, Henry Whitney's lockbox clutched in her hands. "And I have the evidence to prove it." Will had never been so glad to see anyone in his life. Maggie's hair had come loose from its pins. Her dress was smudged with dirt from the tunnels, but her eyes blazed with triumph as they met his. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he acknowledged, unable to keep a hint of admiration from his voice. "You're looking well for a woman who's spent the day being hunted." "The same could be said for you, Mr. Brennan." A smile touched her lips briefly, before her expression hardened as she turned to Marshal Collins. "Marshal, this box contains Henry Whitney's personal records of land transactions in Laramie County, including evidence of bribery fraud and embezzlement from Union Pacific payroll accounts." "These," Caldwell hissed, "the desperate fabrications of a woman scorned." Maggie's eyebrow arched. "Scorned, hardly. But let's discuss fabrications, shall we?" She opened the box and withdrew a particular document. "Like this telegram from your Boston office to your man in Chicago, dated 3 days before my husband's factory burned down." She read aloud, Sullivan acquisition, unsuccessful, stop proceed with alternative arrangements, stop ensure no connection to Cience Holdings, stop. Caldwell's face went ashen. Where did you get that? Henry Whitney was thorough, Eleanor said, stepping forward. When he began to suspect you, he requested information from contacts in Boston. Former clients, business associates, people who remembered Harrison Caldwell's methods from before he reinvented himself in Wyoming. This proves nothing, Caldwell blustered, but his voice had lost its authority. Perhaps not on its own, Marshall Collins agreed, but combined with these other documents and the testimony of multiple witnesses, it's certainly enough to justify a full investigation. He nodded to two deputies who had entered behind him. Secure Mr. Caldwell and his associates. We'll sort this out properly at the territorial offices. As the deputies moved to handcuff Caldwell, Morgan made his move. With snake-like speed, he drew his weapon and lunged toward Maggie, grabbing her arm and pressing his revolver to her temple. Nobody moves, he snarled, or the widow gets a third eye. The room froze. Marshall Collins raised a placating hand. Easy now. Think about what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, Morgan replied. Mr. Caldwell and I are walking out of here. Once we're safely away, I'll release the woman. Will caught Maggie's eye. Something passed between them, a moment of silent communication born of shared danger. Her fingers shifted slightly on the box she still held, and he understood her intention. Morgan, Will said, drawing the gunman's attention. You remember me, don't you, from Kansas, the bank robbery where you shot my son? Morgan's eyes narrowed. Should have shot you too, Brennan. Probably, Will agreed. But you didn't. That was your mistake. And what's yours? Morgan sneered. Thinking you can talk your way out of this? No, Will shook his head. My mistake was waiting too long to do this. In that instant, Maggie brought the heavy metal lockbox up sharply, catching Morgan under the chin. The gunman's head snapped back, his grip on her loosening just enough. Will lunged forward, tackling Morgan around the waist and driving him into the wall. The revolver discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet splintering the ceiling beam. They grappled furiously, Morgan fighting with the desperate strength of a man facing the gallows. But Will had been waiting 5 years for this moment, ever since he'd watched Morgan walk free after gunning down his 17-year-old son. All the rage, grief, and thwarted justice of those years fueled every punch. Morgan managed to slam a knee into Will's ribs, driving the breath from his lungs. As Will staggered, Morgan scrambled for his fallen revolver. His fingers had just closed around the grip when another shot rang out. Morgan jerked, then slowly toppled sideways, a red stain blossoming across his chest. Behind him stood Sheriff Tucker, his service revolver still smoking in his hand. The room fell silent. Tucker met Will's stunned gaze, then holstered his weapon. He resisted arrest, Tucker said flatly. Then to Marshall Collins, I'm turning myself in, Marshall. Whatever charges apply for my part in this mess, I'll answer to them. Collins nodded grimly. A wise decision, Sheriff. As deputies secured the remaining gunman and led a shaken Caldwell away, Will turned to find Maggie watching him, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. Are you hurt? He asked. She shook her head. Nothing permanent. Her gaze moved to Morgan's body, then back to Will. Was he really the man who killed your son? Yes. Will's voice was rough with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. 5 years ago, during a bank robbery in Kansas. I was serving as deputy marshal then. James, my boy, was working as a teller to earn money for college. I'm sorry, Maggie said softly, for your loss, and that you had to relive it today. Don't be. Will's eyes held hers. Morgan's death doesn't bring James back, but knowing Caldwell will face justice for everything he's done that matters. Marshall Collins approached them. Mr. Brennan, Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'll need formal statements from both of you. And that evidence. He nodded toward the lockbox Maggie still clutched. But it can wait until morning. You both look like you could use some rest. The boarding house, Maggie began. Is still being searched by Caldwell's men, Eleanor interrupted. You'll both stay at my sister's home tonight. It's on the edge of town, far from prying eyes. As they stepped out of the jailhouse into the cool Wyoming night, Will noticed Maggie shivering. Without a word, he removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. Thank you, she murmured. For this and for earlier with Morgan. Seemed like you had the situation well in hand, Will replied with the ghost of a smile. That was quick thinking with the box. Theater life, Maggie shrugged. You learn to improvise. They walked in companionable silence for a time, following Eleanor through Laramie's darkened streets. The town seemed different now, as if Caldwell's arrest had already changed its very atmosphere. What happens now? Maggie asked finally. With Caldwell, I mean. Trial, most likely, Will said. Though men like him often find ways to avoid the full consequences of their actions. Not this time, Eleanor said firmly, her voice carrying in the quiet night. Henry kept records of everything, including connections to officials in Cheyenne and beyond. Harrison's entire network will be exposed. And Union Pacific, Maggie pressed. Will they be held accountable for their part in this? Will sighed. Corporations have deeper pockets than any individual and shorter memories when it comes to misdeeds. They'll likely claim Caldwell acted alone, sacrificing him to protect their interests. So there's no real justice. Maggie's voice held bitter disappointment. Will stopped walking, turning to face her. In the silver moonlight, her face was a study in contrasts, soft curves, and hard determination. There's the justice we make, he said quietly. Caldwell will face charges. His victims, including you, will have a chance to testify. The truth will be known. Is that enough? Sometimes it has to be, Eleanor interrupted gently. You two can debate philosophy in the morning. Right now, you both need food and rest. Sarah's house is just ahead. As they continued walking, Will found himself acutely aware of Maggie beside him. Her resilience throughout the day, her quick thinking in the jailhouse, her unwavering pursuit of the truth despite the dangers. She was unlike any woman he'd known, certainly nothing like the mail-order bride Caldwell had expected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Statements to the marshal evidence to present perhaps threats from Caldwell's remaining allies. But tonight, walking through the quiet streets of Laramie with Maggie O'Sullivan at his side, Will felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 long years. Hope. Eleanor led them to a small house on a quiet street. As she climbed the porch steps and knocked softly, Will and Maggie hung back slightly. I never thanked you properly, Maggie said suddenly, for stepping in at the train station. You didn't know me had no reason to help, yet you risked everything. Will studied her in the moonlight. I knew enough, he said simply. I recognized something in you then. Courage, determination, the same qualities that saved us today. Before Maggie could respond, the door opened, revealing a gray-haired woman in a nightdress and robe. Eleanor! My heavens, what's happened? The whole town's talking about arrests and shootings at the jail. It's a long story, Sarah. Eleanor sighed. These are my friends William Brennan and Margaret O'Sullivan. They need sanctuary tonight. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in their disheveled appearance. Of course, come in, come in. I'll put on coffee and heat some stew. As they stepped into the warmth and light of Sarah's kitchen, the lockbox still secure under Maggie's arm, Will caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. A rider passing on the darkened street, pausing briefly to observe the house before continuing on. Caldwell might be in custody, but his influence remained. The battle wasn't over yet. Will woke with a start hand, instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Pale dawn light filtered through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, he couldn't place his surroundings. Not his cabin, not the jail cell. Then memory returned. Sarah Whitney's spare room offered as sanctuary after the confrontation at the jailhouse. He sat up, cataloging aches and bruises from the previous day's fight. His ribs protested where Morgan had landed that desperate knee. Nothing broken, but he'd feel it for weeks. Voices drifted from elsewhere in the house. Women's voices, low and serious. Will dressed quickly, buckling on the borrowed belt and holster Sarah's late husband had left behind. The revolver was an older model Remington, but it would serve if needed. In the kitchen, he found Maggie and Eleanor huddled with Sarah over cups of coffee, their conversation halting abruptly as he entered. "Ladies, what pursuit is?" He nodded. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Eleanor said, though something in her expression suggested otherwise. "Coffee?" Will accepted the offered cup, studying the three women. Something had shifted overnight. The relief of Caldwell's arrest had been replaced by a new tension. "What's happened?" he asked directly. The women exchanged glances. Finally, Maggie spoke. "Marshal Collins sent word an hour ago. Judge Wilson has called an emergency hearing for noon today." "That's unusually prompt," Will said carefully. "Indeed." Eleanor's mouth tightened. "Especially considering Wilson should be under investigation himself for his role in Caldwell's schemes." "It gets worse," Maggie added. "The hearing isn't at the courthouse. It's at the Union Pacific offices with the company's attorneys present." Will absorbed this, the implications clear. "They're circling the wagons." "Precisely," Eleanor said grimly. "Union Pacific can't afford a public scandal. Investors would panic, stock prices would plummet. They need to contain this as quickly and quietly as possible." "And Caldwell?" Will asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Released to house arrest at first light," Sarah reported. "My neighbor's boy saw him returning to his mansion, escorted by company men rather than the marshal's deputies." Will set down his coffee cup, his appetite gone. "So much for justice." "It's not over," Maggie said firmly. "We still have the evidence, the witnesses." Marshal Collins seemed genuinely committed to investigating fully. "Collins is one man," Will countered. "Union Pacific employs armies of lawyers and has senators in their pockets. They'll bury this under procedural delays until the public loses interest, then quietly dismiss the charges when no one's looking. Then we force them to look." Maggie stood, her eyes flashing with determination. "We take this beyond Laramie, beyond Wyoming territory. We make it a story no one can ignore." Will raised an eyebrow. "How exactly?" "Frank Donovan," she replied. "He's not just any reporter. He's the Chicago Tribune's lead investigative journalist known for exposing corporate corruption. If he publishes what we know about Caldwell in Union Pacific newspapers across the country, we'll pick it up." Will considered this. The power of the press was indeed formidable, but Donovan answers to editors who answer to publishers who have their own financial interests. One telegram from Union Pacific threatening to pull advertising dollars is meaningless if the story's already in print, Maggie cut in. "That's why we need to get Donovan everything today before the hearing. Once it's telegraphed to Chicago, not even Union Pacific can stop it." Will studied her face, the determination in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. This wasn't just about justice anymore. For Maggie, this was personal. Caldwell had likely been responsible for her husband's death, had certainly tried to destroy her future. She wouldn't back down. "All right," he said finally. "Where's Donovan now?" "At the telegraph office," Eleanor replied, "sending preliminary reports to Chicago. He's expecting us at 8 with the complete documentation." Will glanced at the mantel clock, just past 6. "Then we have work to do." They divided tasks efficiently. Eleanor would gather statements from Laramie citizens willing to testify about Caldwell's pressure tactics. Sarah would locate Arthur Hargrove and the other shopkeepers who had opposed Union Pacific's monopolistic practices. Will and Maggie would organize Henry Whitney's evidence, connecting it to Caldwell's Boston operations and the factory fires. They commandeered Sarah's dining table, spreading documents in chronological order. Will watched with admiration as Maggie's trained bookkeeper's eye caught patterns he would have missed. "Look here," she said, pointing to a series of entries. These withdrawals from Union Pacific payroll accounts always occur 3 days before large deposits to Caldwell's personal account at his Boston bank. Will leaned closer, acutely aware of her scent soap and coffee, and something uniquely Maggie. How much total? She ran calculations swiftly. Nearly $50,000 over 3 years, and that's just what Henry documented. Enough to buy half of Laramie, Will muttered. Or finance arson against competitors in Boston, Maggie added grimly. She pulled another document forward, the telegram mentioning Sullivan acquisition and alternative arrangements. This was sent just before Robert's factory burned. The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. Will studied her face. This won't bring him back, Maggie. Her eyes met his vulnerability briefly visible beneath her determination. I know, but it might stop Caldwell from destroying more lives. She hesitated, then asked, Did seeing Morgan die bring you peace? Amit. The question caught Will off guard with its directness. No, he admitted after a moment. But knowing he can never hurt another family, that helps. Maggie nodded understanding in her eyes. They worked in silence for a time, organizing evidence into a narrative Donovan could follow easily. The intimacy of the task heads bent together over documents, fingers occasionally brushing, created a strange bubble around them, as if the rest of Laramie had temporarily ceased to exist. A knock at the front door shattered that bubble. Sarah answered, admitting Frank Donovan and Arthur Hargrove. Both men looked grim. We have trouble, Donovan announced without preamble. Union Pacific's senior counsel arrived from Cheyenne on the dawn train, along with 3 federal marshals answering directly to the railroad commissioner. The telegraph office is being watched, Hargrove added. Any wire Donovan sends will be read before it leaves the territory. Will's jaw tightened, and Marshal Collins, ordered back to Cheyenne ostensibly to report to his superiors, Donovan said. Though I suspect it's to get him out of the way while this plays out. What about Tucker? Will asked. He shot Morgan. He's a witness to Caldwell's attempted jailbreak. Hargrove and Donovan exchanged glances. Tucker's dead, Hargrove said flatly. Found in his cell an hour ago. Suicide, according to Judge Wilson's preliminary ruling. The room fell silent as they absorbed this. Tucker had been corrupt, but his final act had been one of redemption. Now he'd been silenced permanently. They're eliminating witnesses, Maggie said softly. Not just witnesses, Donovan corrected. Evidence, too. The jailhouse records from yesterday have vanished. No documentation of Caldwell's visit, Morgan's death, nothing. Will's mind raced through implications. They can't erase what happened. Too many people saw it. People can be pressured, bought, or frightened into silence, Donovan countered, especially when Union Pacific controls their livelihoods. What about Henry's evidence? Eleanor asked, gesturing to the documents spread across the table. Useful but incomplete without corroborating testimony, Donovan admitted, and potentially dismissible as the bitter record-keeping of a disgruntled former employee. So we're back where we started, Will said grimly, with Caldwell holding all the cards. Not quite all, Maggie interjected. She pulled a particular document from the pile different from the others on heavier paper with an official seal. This is a certified copy of Union Pacific's original land grant from the federal government. Henry had it notarized in Cheyenne before his death. Donovan took it, scanning quickly. The covenant clause, he murmured. Interesting. What covenant clause? Will asked. Maggie pointed to a paragraph of dense legal text. The original federal land grants to railroads included provisions that the land must be used for the public good and benefit. The railroad was prohibited from engaging in monopolistic practices detrimental to local commerce and settlement. Donovan's eyes lit with understanding. And if they violated that covenant, the land reverts to federal ownership, Maggie finished. Every acre acquired through Union Pacific's land grants, including all of Caldwell's holdings. Will whistled softly. That would destroy him. And potentially cost Union Pacific millions, Donovan added. No wonder they're desperate to suppress this. He carefully refolded the document. This needs to reach the territorial governor immediately before Wilson's hearing. The stagecoach, Hargrove suggested. Donovan shook his head. Too slow, and the railroad telegraph is compromised. There's another way, Eleanor said quietly. Everyone turned to her. The old military telegraph line. It hasn't been used since the war, but Henry maintained the connection to our ranch house. It runs directly to Fort Laramie, bypassing the commercial lines entirely. Does it still work? Will asked. Last I checked, yes. Henry was meticulous about maintenance. Eleanor's eyes met Will's. But the ranch is 10 miles out, and you can be certain Caldwell has men watching the roads. Will considered their options. They needed to get the covenant document and supporting evidence to the governor before noon. They also needed to ensure Donovan could file his story with the Chicago Tribune. And they had to do both, while evading Caldwell's men. We split up, he said finally. Donovan takes the covenant document to the ranch and sends it via military telegraph. The rest of us attend Wilson's hearing with copies of the evidence. If Caldwell tries anything there, he'll have to do it with witnesses. He'll have men watching for you specifically, Hargrove warned Will. After yesterday, you're his primary target. Good, Will said grimly. Let him focus on me. Meanwhile, Maggie can present Henry's evidence at the hearing. Maggie shook her head immediately. I'm going with Donovan to the ranch. I'm the one who can authenticate Henry's records and explain the financial evidence. You take the copies to the hearing and keep Caldwell distracted. Will wanted to argue to insist she stay where he could protect her, but he recognized the logic of her plan. She was right. Her expertise with the financial records made her the ideal person to communicate with the governor. Fine, he conceded. But you'll need protection. Hargrove, can you ride with them? The mercantile owner nodded. I can handle a rifle well enough. And I'll accompany you to the hearing, Eleanor said to Will. Harrison won't expect me to have the courage to face him after Henry's death. The surprise might unbalance him. Plans made, they gathered the necessary documents. Will pulled Donovan aside as the others prepared to leave. If anything happens to her, he said quietly, I'll hold you personally responsible. Donovan met his gaze steadily. She's not what you expected, is she? When she stepped off that train. Will's eyes drifted to Maggie efficiently organizing documents into a leather portfolio. No, he admitted. She's more. I'll protect her with my life, Donovan promised. But between you and me, Brennan, I think she might end up protecting us. They separated at the edge of town, Donovan, Maggie, and Hargrove riding east toward the Whitney Ranch, while Will and Eleanor headed toward the Union Pacific offices in the heart of Laramie. The plan was simple: create enough of a distraction at the hearing to give Donovan and Maggie time to reach the ranch and send the telegram. As they approached the imposing brick building that housed Union Pacific's regional headquarters, Will noted the increased security company men posted at the entrance checking everyone who entered. Among them, he recognized two of the gunmen from the previous night's confrontation at the jail. Caldwell's not taking chances, he murmured to Eleanor. Neither are we, she replied, patting her reticule where she carried a derringer small but deadly at close range. They presented themselves at the entrance where a clerk checked a list of names. Brennan and Whitney, the clerk announced loudly. Judge Wilson is expecting you in the conference room. One of the gunmen smirked as they passed. Enjoy the hearing, he said, the threat evident in his tone. The conference room occupied the building's second floor, a large space dominated by a mahogany table. Judge Wilson sat at its head with Harrison Caldwell at his right hand. Beside Caldwell sat an older man in an expensive suit the Union Pacific Council Will presumed. Several other men in business attire filled the remaining seats. Conspicuously absent were Marshal Collins and any representatives of territorial law enforcement. This was a railroad proceeding, not a legal one. Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Whitney, Judge Wilson nodded as they entered. Please be seated. We're convening this hearing to address certain allegations regarding Mr. Caldwell's business practices. Will didn't move toward the indicated chairs. Where's Marshall Collins? This is a criminal matter involving attempted murder, corruption, and fraud. Marshall Collins has returned to Cheyenne on official business, Wilson replied smoothly. As the local judicial authority, I'm conducting this preliminary inquiry to determine if any charges have merit. Merit! Eleanor's voice cut through the room like a whip. My husband documented years of systematic fraud. Sheriff Tucker witnessed Caldwell's attempt to illegally remove prisoners, and dozens of citizens saw Morgan's men terrorizing this town on Caldwell's orders. Allegations require evidence, Mrs. Whitney, the Union Pacific attorney interjected, and witnesses. Currently, we have neither. Sheriff Tucker is dead, Will said flatly, conveniently labeled a suicide before any investigation could occur. Caldwell spoke for the first time, his composure fully restored after the previous night's events. A tragedy, to be sure. Tucker was clearly unstable, as demonstrated by his unprovoked shooting of Mr. Morgan. His suicide, while regrettable, is hardly surprising given his mental state. Will's hand twitched toward the borrowed Remington at his hip, but Eleanor's warning touch on his arm steadied him. They needed to buy time, not provoke a confrontation. We have evidence, Will said instead, patting the satchel containing their copies of Henry's documents. Extensive documentation of Mr. Caldwell's activities both here and in Boston. Excellent, Wilson said with false enthusiasm. Please present it so we may examine it thoroughly. Will hesitated. Surrendering their only copies would be foolish, but they needed to maintain the charade until Donovan and Maggie reached the ranch. Before we do, Eleanor interjected smoothly, I believe proper procedure requires all interested parties to be present. Specifically the Territorial Prosecutor's Office and representatives of the governor. Wilson frowned. This is merely a preliminary inquiry, Mrs. Whitney. Those officials will be notified if we determine the matter warrants their attention. And who makes that determination? Will asked. You, Judge Wilson, a man whose name appears repeatedly in Henry Whitney's records as a recipient of Caldwell's special considerations. Wilson's face flushed. You are dangerously close to contempt, Mr. Brennan. Contempt implies respect for the court, Will replied evenly. I see no court here, just a railroad company protecting its interests. The Union Pacific attorney stood. Mr. Brennan, these inflammatory accusations serve no purpose. Either present your evidence or this hearing will be adjourned. Will glanced at the clock on the wall. Not even 9. Donovan and Maggie would need at least another hour to reach the ranch, assuming they encountered no obstacles. He needed to keep the hearing going, keep Caldwell occupied. Very well, he said, opening the satchel. Let's discuss specific instances of fraud, beginning with the manipulation of payroll accounts for Union Pacific workers. As Will began presenting selected documents, carefully withholding the most damning evidence, he watched Caldwell. The banker maintained a mask of bored indifference, but his eyes revealed his true state, calculating, wary, constantly assessing the threat level. For 30 minutes, Will detailed specific transactions, dates, amounts. The Union Pacific attorney interrupted frequently with objections about the documentation's authenticity, which Wilson invariably sustained. The charade was transparent. They had no intention of taking any evidence seriously. Finally, as Will presented a document showing Caldwell's acquisition of foreclosed properties, the banker himself interrupted. This is becoming tedious, Caldwell sighed. Mr. Brennan clearly harbors a personal vendetta against me stemming from my legitimate business dealings. These fabricated accusations waste everyone's time. Fabricated? Will's voice hardened. Like the arson that destroyed my forge. Like the false arrest warrant that put me in jail, like Tucker's convenient suicide. Caldwell smiled thinly. Your forge fire was ruled accidental. Coal dust is notoriously combustible. Your arrest was based on witness statements since retracted. As for Sheriff Tucker, the man clearly had a guilty conscience. He shrugged elegantly. Tragic coincidences, nothing more. And my husband's death, Eleanor asked quietly. Another coincidence. A flicker of genuine emotion crossed Caldwell's face. Not guilt, but something closer to regret. Henry Whitney was a valued colleague whose health unfortunately failed him. I've always spoken highly of his service to this community. While systematically destroying everything he built, Eleanor countered. The Union Pacific attorney intervened again. Mrs. Whitney, these unsubstantiated accusations are inappropriate. If you have evidence of wrongdoing related to your husband's death, present it. Otherwise, I must insist we return to the specific allegations at hand. We'll check the clock again. Almost 10. Still not enough time, but he was running out of ways to prolong the hearing. He exchanged a glance with Eleanor, who gave him an imperceptible nod. Time for a more direct approach. Let's discuss Robert O'Sullivan's factory fire in Boston, Will said, pulling out the telegram Maggie had found. Specifically, this communication from Caldwell's office ordering alternative arrangements after Sullivan refused to sell to Caldwell and Sons. Caldwell's composure finally slipped. Where did you get that? Henry Whitney had friends everywhere, including Boston, Eleanor said. After you killed him, I continued his correspondence. It's amazing what people will share about a man like you, Harrison. For the first time, uncertainty showed in Caldwell's expression. He hadn't anticipated this connection to his Boston past. This is absurd, he blustered. I had no involvement with any factory fire in Boston. I've never even met this Sullivan person. Yet your company tried to acquire his factory, Will pressed. And when he refused, it burned down under suspicious circumstances, just like every other competitor who stood in your way. Circumstantial at best, the Union Pacific attorney declared, and completely irrelevant to the matter at hand. Judge Wilson nodded. I agree. Mr. Brennan, unless you can produce direct evidence linking Mr. Caldwell to criminal activity in Laramie, I'm inclined to dismiss these allegations entirely. Will was preparing another delaying tactic when commotion erupted from downstairs, raised voices, the sound of multiple boots on the stairs. The conference room door burst open, revealing two of Caldwell's guards, their expressions urgent. Sir, one addressed Caldwell, directly ignoring Judge Wilson. Riders were spotted heading for the Whitney Ranch, the woman and the reporter. Caldwell stood abruptly. Intercept them, now. Too late, the guard said grimly. They reached the ranch 10 minutes ago. The blood drained from Caldwell's face. The military telegraph line. Damn Henry Whitney and his contingencies. He turned to the Union Pacific attorney. They'll contact the governor. We need to move quickly. The attorney nodded, gathering his papers. This hearing is adjourned pending further review. He announced all pretense of judicial process abandoned. No, Will said, drawing the Remington. It's not. The room froze. Judge Wilson half rose from his seat, then thought better of it. The guards reached for their weapons, but stopped when Will cocked the hammer. Mr. Brennan, Caldwell said carefully, put down the gun. You're only making things worse for yourself. Worse than what you planned for me. Will kept the revolver steady. I don't think so. Eleanor moved to the conference room door, blocking it with her small frame. From her reticule, she produced the Derringer. Gentlemen, we're going to continue this discussion until we receive word from the governor's office. No one leaves. Caldwell's mask of civility finally shattered completely. You fools! Do you really think a territorial governor can stand against Union Pacific? We built this territory. We own it. One telegram from our board chairman to Washington, and your precious governor will be replaced before sunset. Perhaps, Will acknowledged, but the covenant clause in your original land grant can't be erased so easily. Neither can the Chicago Tribune's front-page story about Union Pacific's systematic corruption in Wyoming Territory. Uncertainty flickered in Caldwell's eyes. What covenant clause? The one requiring all railroad land acquisitions to serve the public good. Will explained satisfaction coursing through him at Caldwell's confusion. The one that causes all your holdings to revert to federal ownership if violations are proven. The one Henry Whitney had notarized and kept safe all these years. You're bluffing, Caldwell said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Will nodded toward the window. Look outside, Caldwell. See those riders approaching. That's the territorial marshal returning from Cheyenne, along with the governor's representatives. They received Maggie's telegram 20 minutes ago. Caldwell rushed to the window. Sure enough, a group of mounted men was approaching the Union Pacific building, Marshal Collins recognizable at their head. It's over, Harrison, Eleanor said quietly. Henry's truth finally prevailed. Caldwell turned from the window, his face a mask of rage. With sudden violence, he lunged across the table, not at Will, but at Eleanor, clearly identifying her as the weaker target. As Will swung the Remington around, one of the guards drew his weapon. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. The guard crumpled Will's bullet, finding its mark. But Caldwell had reached Eleanor, wresting the derringer from her hand. He wrapped an arm around her throat, using her as a shield, as he backed toward a side door. "Drop the gun, Brennan," he ordered, "or the widow joins her husband." Will hesitated, the Remington still raised. Eleanor's eyes met his over Caldwell's arm, calm, resolute, unafraid. "Don't you dare," she said firmly, "not after everything we've done to get here." Caldwell tightened his grip. "I'm leaving this building. Anyone tries to stop me, she dies first." "And then what?" Will asked, keeping his voice level. "Where will you go? The governor knows everything. The Tribune's story will be in every newspaper by tomorrow. There's nowhere left to run, Caldwell." "There's always somewhere for a man with money," Caldwell replied. He continued backing toward the door, dragging Eleanor with him. "I rebuilt once after Boston. I can do it again." The standoff was interrupted by the sound of horses' outside boots on the stairs. Marshal Collins's voice called out orders as his men secured the building. Desperation flashed across Caldwell's face. In that moment, Will saw the truth. The banker had no real plan, just the cornered animal's instinct to escape at any cost. Caldwell had spent his life manipulating systems, buying influence, operating from the shadows. Direct confrontation wasn't his arena. "Last chance, Brennan," Caldwell warned, pressing the derringer against Eleanor's temple. "Drop the gun, or she dies." Will lowered his weapon slowly, placing it on the table. "Let her go, Harrison. It's me you want. I'm the one who started all this by defending Maggie at the station." Caldwell laughed harshly. "You think this is about your frontier gallantry? This started years ago when Henry Whitney began questioning my methods, when he started keeping those damned records." His grip on Eleanor tightened. "I should have eliminated both Whitneys when I had the chance." As Caldwell reached the side door, still using Eleanor as a shield, the main door burst open. Marshal Collins entered, revolver drawn, flanked by 2 deputies. "Harrison Caldwell," Collins announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and suspicion in the death of Sheriff Tucker." Caldwell's response was to drag Eleanor through the side door, slamming it behind them. Will lunged for his discarded Remington, then raced after them with Collins close behind. The side door led to a narrow staircase descending to an alley behind the building. Will emerged in time to see Caldwell forcing Eleanor into a waiting carriage, the derringer still pressed against her. "Caldwell?" Will shouted. "It's over!" Caldwell turned, desperation etched on his face. "Nothing's over until I say it is." He fired the derringer wildly in Will's direction, the small caliber bullet splintering the doorframe inches from his head. Will raised the Remington, but Caldwell had already pushed Eleanor into the carriage and was climbing in after her. The driver whipped the horses and the carriage lurched forward. "Get after them!" Collins ordered his deputies, who ran for their horses. To Will he added, "We have men at all the roads out of town. He won't get far." Will wasn't listening. His focus narrowed to the retreating carriage and the flutter of Eleanor's gray hair visible through its window. Caldwell had nothing left to lose now. What would stop him from eliminating his hostage once she served her purpose? As the carriage careened down the alley toward Main Street, another wagon suddenly pulled across its path from a side street. The carriage driver hauled on the reins, horses rearing, as the vehicles collided with a splintering crash. Will raced toward the accident, Remington ready. As he approached, he saw the driver of the blocking wagon, Arthur Hargrove, a shotgun across his lap. "Right on schedule," Hargrove called to Will. "Figured he'd try the back way." The carriage door burst open, and Caldwell stumbled out, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. He still clutched the Derringer, still had Eleanor's arm in a vice-like grip. "Stay back!" he shouted, looking wildly from Will to Hargrove to the approaching deputies. "It's finished, Harrison," Will said, advancing slowly. "Let Mrs. Whitney go." "Nothing's finished," Caldwell snarled. "I built this town. I own this territory. A shot rang out, but not from Will's Remington or the deputy's weapons. Caldwell staggered, a look of profound surprise crossing his face. The Derringer fell from his suddenly limp fingers as he collapsed to his knees, then toppled forward onto the dusty street. Behind him stood Maggie O'Sullivan, a smoking revolver in her steady hand. "That," she said quietly, "was for my husband, and for Henry Whitney, and for everyone else whose lives you destroyed." As Eleanor rushed into Hargrove's waiting arms and Marshal Collins hurried to secure the scene, Will crossed to Maggie. She stood perfectly still, the revolver still extended, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd done. Gently, Will took the weapon from her hand. "It's over," he said softly. "He can't hurt anyone else now." Maggie's eyes met his, a complex storm of emotions visible in their green depths: relief, shock, grief, and something else. Something that made Will's heart beat faster despite the chaos surrounding them. "The telegram," he asked. "Sent and acknowledged," she confirmed. "The governor's ordered a full investigation of Union Pacific's land acquisitions. Donovan's story is already on the wire to Chicago." A small, fierce smile touched her lips. "We won, Will." He wanted to pull her into his arms, then to hold her close, and never let go. But there would be time for that later. For now, they had statements to give, evidence to present, a future to begin building from the ashes of Caldwell's destruction. "Yes," he agreed, allowing himself to rest a hand lightly on her shoulder. "We won." Around them, Laramie seemed to exhale collectively, as if the town itself had been holding its breath during Caldwell's reign. The shadow that had hung over it for years was lifting at last. But as Will surveyed the scene, Caldwell's body being covered, Eleanor trembling in Hargrove's embrace, Maggie still pale with shock, he knew that true justice was more complicated than a single bullet could resolve. The damage Caldwell had done stretched from Wyoming to Boston, touching countless lives. Rebuilding would take time. And then there was Maggie herself. She had come to Laramie seeking a new beginning. Instead, she had found old ghosts and fresh violence. What would she want now that her husband's killer had faced justice? Would she stay in Wyoming or return to the life she'd known in Boston? As if sensing his thoughts, Maggie turned to him. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Will glanced toward his burned-out forge at the edge of town, then back to the woman who had changed everything in just a few short days. "Now," he said, "we rebuild." Autumn came to Laramie with startling swiftness, painting the distant mountains with gold and crimson. 3 months had passed since Harrison Caldwell's death in the dusty street, 3 months of testimonies, investigations, and the slow, arduous process of rebuilding a town from the ashes of corruption. Will stood on the newly constructed porch of his forge, watching the sunrise illuminate the countryside. The rebuilt structure was larger than its predecessor, with a proper workshop attached, and living quarters expanded to include an office. The Union Pacific reparation funds negotiated as part of the territorial settlement had provided unexpected resources for many of Caldwell's victims. The clang of the morning stage interrupted his reverie. It would be carrying the latest newspapers from Chicago, and points east, including the ongoing series Frank Donovan was publishing about railroad corruption in the territories. The stories had created a national sensation, leading to congressional inquiries and a complete restructuring of Union Pacific's management. Will made his way into town, nodding to familiar faces along the way. People greeted him differently now, with respect, tinged with something like awe. The man who had stood against Harrison Caldwell and lived to tell the tale had become something of a local legend, much to Will's discomfort. The center of Laramie had transformed as well. With Caldwell's chokehold on business lifted, new shops had opened. The courthouse had been renovated under the supervision of the new judge, a stern but fair woman appointed directly by the governor, the first female judge in Wyoming Territory, a fact that had caused considerable comment in newspapers nationwide. At the general store, Will collected his mail along with the latest Chicago Tribune. Donovan's byline featured prominently on the front page, Union Pacific directors indicted in ongoing corruption probe. "More good news," Arthur Hargrove asked, coming to stand beside Will as he read. "Justice moves slowly, but it moves," Will replied, folding the newspaper. "How's business?" Hargrove's smile was answer enough. "Better than ever. Without Caldwell's price-fixing, I can offer fair rates to the ranchers. Even opened a credit line for the smaller operations hit odd by last winter." Will nodded approvingly. This was the true victory, not just Caldwell's demise, but the restoration of honest commerce and community support that had always been Laramie's true foundation. "Any word from Boston?" Hargrove asked casually, though his eyes were keen. Will stiffened slightly. "Nothing new." He changed the subject. "Eleanor's property dispute going before the judge today. I should head over to the courthouse." "Of course." Hargrove didn't press, but his knowing look followed Will out the door. The courthouse steps were already crowded when Will arrived. Eleanor Whitney stood at their center, dignity personified in her gray silk dress and perfectly arranged silver hair. Since Henry's posthumous vindication, she had emerged as a powerful voice in Laramie's rebuilding, using her considerable knowledge of the region's history to guide the restitution process. "William," she greeted him warmly. "Right on time." "Wouldn't miss it," he replied. "Today's the final ruling." She nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. "The last of Harrison's land grabs overturned. The judge will formally restore the eastern watershed rights to my family's holdings." "Henry would be proud," Will said softly. "Henry would say it's about time," Eleanor corrected with a small smile. "But yes, he would be pleased to see justice finally served." Her expression grew more serious. "Have you heard from her?" Will didn't pretend to misunderstand. "2 letters, one from Chicago last month, where she was meeting with Donovan's editors. Another from Boston last week, settling her husband's estate. And nothing," Will shrugged, trying for nonchalance and failing miserably. "She's busy. The government's case against Caldwell's former associates in Boston requires her testimony." Eleanor studied him with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated generations of Laramie residents. "You miss her?" It wasn't a question, so Will didn't bother denying it. "She has her life to rebuild. We all do." "Some things are better built together," Eleanor observed. Before Will could respond, a clerk appeared at the courthouse door, calling Eleanor's case. "We'll continue this discussion later," she promised, patting Will's arm before ascending the steps. Will remained outside, reluctant to spend the beautiful autumn morning in the stuffy courtroom. Instead, he wandered toward the telegraph office as he did most days. A foolish habit, checking for messages that never came. Inside, Tommy Wheeler, recently promoted from errand boy to assistant operator, greeted him with a knowing smile. "Nothing today, Mr. Brennan. Will nodded, hiding his disappointment. Just passing by Tommy. The boy's grin widened. Sure thing, same as yesterday. And the day before. Will fixed him with a stern look that only made Tommy's smile broaden. The boy had grown bolder since the Caldwell affair, like many of Laramie's youngsters who'd witnessed ordinary citizens standing up to power. Mind your telegraph, boy, Will growled without heat. He continued his morning rounds, checking in with various members of what the Chicago Tribune had dubbed the Laramie Resistance. Most had returned to their normal lives, Hargrove to his store, Judge Wilson's former clerk to his new position with the territorial court, the ranchers to their spreads. But the bonds forged in those tense days remained, creating a stronger community than Laramie had known in years. By noon, Will had run out of excuses to remain in town. The forge awaited. He had orders for winter plowshares, repairs to the stagecoach line's equipment, and a special commission from the new territorial office for decorative railings. Work enough to keep his hands busy, if not his mind. As he turned toward home, a commotion near the station caught his attention. The eastbound train had arrived, disgorging passengers and mail. Nothing unusual there, but something about the cluster of people near the platform's end made Will pause. A woman stood with her back to him, directing porters with her luggage. Something in her posture, the confident set of her shoulders, the rich auburn of her hair. Will's heart stuttered in his chest. Maggie. He breathed too softly for anyone to hear. As if sensing his presence, she turned. Even at a distance, her green eyes found his unerringly. For a moment, neither moved. Then Maggie smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had haunted Will's dreams for 3 months, and began walking toward him. She looked different. The severe traveling dress was gone, replaced by a fashionable blue ensemble that complemented her figure without attempting to disguise it. She moved with new confidence, head high, stride, purposeful. "Mr. Brennan," she greeted him when they were finally face to face. "I was hoping I might find you in town." "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he replied formally, though his voice roughened on her name. "Welcome back to Laramie." They stood awkwardly, 3 months of absence, and 1,000 unspoken words between them. Will took in every detail hungrily, the subtle changes in her appearance, the new assurance in her bearing, the slight uncertainty in her eyes as she regarded him. "You've rebuilt the forge," she said finally. "Arthur wrote to me about it." "You've been corresponding with Hargrove. And Eleanor, and Frank Donovan, of course." She hesitated. "I wanted to stay informed about Laramie's recovery." "I see." Will struggled to keep his tone neutral. "And Boston, your husband's affairs." "Settled, finally. The government's case against Caldwell's former partners helped immensely. The insurance company was persuaded to honor their obligations once evidence of arson was formally recognized." Maggie clasped her hands before her. "But that's not why I've returned." Oh, Will couldn't manage more than that single-syllable hope and fear warring within him. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private," she suggested, glancing around at the curious onlookers their reunion had attracted. Will nodded. "My forge, or would you prefer the hotel?" "The forge, I think." Something like mischief sparked in her eyes. "I'm curious to see what you've built from the ashes." They walked in silence, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Will found himself hyper-aware of her presence beside him, the rustle of her skirts, the subtle scent of lavender, the way sunlight caught in her hair. The rebuilt forge stood proud against the Wyoming sky, its stone walls solid and enduring, its new chimney rising like a declaration of permanence. Will led Maggie through the main workshop, noting her appreciative glance at the organized tools and efficient layout. "Through here," he said, opening the door to the office he'd added. It was a simple space desk, bookshelves, a few comfortable chairs. Large windows let in the prairie light, illuminating the ledgers stacked neatly on the desk. "It's wonderful," Maggie said sincerely, running her hand along the polished desk edge. "A proper business now." "The settlement funds helped," Will acknowledged. "But I had a good model to follow. Henry Whitney built to last, even when everyone around him was taking shortcuts. Maggie smiled softly. He would be pleased to be your inspiration. Not just Henry, Will said quietly. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Maggie looked away, first moving to examine the bookshelves. You've added quite a collection. Knowledge is a form of independence, Will said, echoing words Henry had often repeated. I've been studying. Engineering principles, metallurgical advances. Planning for the future, Maggie observed. That's good. The moment stretched between them heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, Will could bear it no longer. Why did you come back, Maggie? He asked directly. The truth. She turned to face him fully, her expression resolute yet vulnerable. Because I realized something in Boston surrounded by my old life. It wasn't home anymore. She took a steadying breath. Home had become a place I'd spent less than a week in. A place where, despite danger and chaos, I felt more alive than I had in years. Will's heart thundered in his chest, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. Laramie's changed since you left. Caldwell's gone, but there are still challenges. It's still a frontier town. I know. That's part of why I came back. Maggie moved closer, close enough that Will could see the determination in her eyes. In Boston, I was always Margaret Sullivan Roberts' widow, defined by my relationship to a man and a tragedy. Here, for the first time, I was just Maggie, myself. And who is that? Will asked softly. Who is Maggie O'Sullivan when she's free to choose her own path? That's what I've come to discover. She smiled a real smile that reached her eyes. I've accepted the territorial office's offer to oversee the audit of Union Pacific's financial records. It's a 6-month appointment, with the possibility of a permanent position afterward. Will blinked in surprise. You'll be staying in Laramie permanently. That depends, Maggie said, holding his gaze steadily, on whether there's a reason to stay beyond the professional opportunity. The moment hung between them fragile and potent. Will had faced Confederate cavalry with less trepidation than he felt now standing before this woman who had upended his carefully constructed solitude. There are several excellent reasons, he said carefully. Laramie is growing. Good people. Opportunities for someone with your skills. Disappointment flickered across Maggie's face. Yes, of course. Practical considerations. And there's another reason. Will continued finding courage in her evident disappointment. A more personal one. Hope returned to her eyes. Oh, there's a blacksmith here, Will said, moving closer until barely a foot separated them. A man who's been rebuilding more than just his forge these past months. Who's discovered that solitude isn't the sanctuary he thought it was, not since a certain Boston widow stepped off the train and showed him what courage really looks like. Maggie's breath caught. This blacksmith sounds like an interesting man. Stubborn, Will corrected. Set in his ways, damaged in places that don't show, but determined to be worthy of a second chance at happiness if that chance were offered. And if it were, Maggie asked softly. Offered, I mean. Instead of answering with words, Will closed the remaining distance between them. Slowly giving her every opportunity to step away, he raised his hand to her cheek. The touch was gossamer light reverent. I missed you, he confessed, the words barely audible. I missed you too, Maggie replied, every day. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, the meeting of two souls who had known too much loss to rush headlong into vulnerability. But the second kiss held promise, and the third certainty. When they finally parted, Will rested his forehead against hers. I should warn you, a blacksmith's wife faces certain challenges in society. Maggie laughed, the sound filling the office with warmth. Is that a proposal, William Brennan? A premature one, he admitted with a sheepish smile. I had planned to court you properly. Dinner's theater in Cheyenne, the full traditional progression. I think we've established that neither of us is particularly traditional, Maggie observed, her eyes dancing with mischief. Besides, we faced death together. That rather accelerates the acquaintance process, don't you think? Will laughed, joy bubbling up from a place he'd thought long dry. When you put it that way, we're practically old married folk already. Not quite, Maggie said, growing more serious. There's still much we don't know about each other. Dreams, fears, habits, both endearing and infuriating. She touched his cheek gently. I want to discover all of it, Will. Slowly, properly. Then let me court you, he said, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. Let me show you Laramie through new eyes, not as Caldwell's fiefdom, but as the home it can be. I'd like that, Maggie smiled. Though I should warn you, I've already leased office space above the bank. The territorial auditor requires suitable quarters. Already planning to stay, were you? Will raised an eyebrow. Rather presumptuous, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Confident, she corrected with a grin. I've become quite the confident woman in my time away. You'll have to get used to it. I look forward to the challenge. They sealed this new understanding with another kiss, this one unhurried and full of promise. When they separated, Will found himself imagining possibilities he hadn't dared consider for years. A shared life, perhaps children, a future built on mutual respect and hard-won wisdom. A knock at the forge door interrupted these reflections. Will reluctantly stepped away from Maggie, calling for the visitor to enter. Eleanor Whitney stepped into the workshop, taking in the scene with knowing eyes. I thought I might find you both here. News travels fast in Laramie. Mrs. Whitney, Maggie greeted her warmly. How lovely to see you again. And you, my dear, especially under these improved circumstances. Eleanor's gaze moved meaningfully between them. I take it you've discussed your return arrangements. We've begun the discussion, Will said, unable to keep the smile from his face. Excellent. Then you'll both join me for dinner this evening to continue it. It wasn't a request. 7 o'clock. The whole town is eager to welcome Maggie back properly. The whole town? Maggie raised an eyebrow. Or the Laramie Resistance? Eleanor's eyes twinkled. We prefer Citizens Committee for Ethical Governance now, more respectable for our new lobbying efforts with the territorial legislature. After Eleanor departed, Maggie turned to Will with amusement. I've been back less than an hour, and already my evening is scheduled. Some things about Laramie haven't changed. Small towns, Will shrugged, though I'd hoped to have you to myself a bit longer. We'll have time, Maggie said softly, taking his hand. That's what we're building here, isn't it? Time together. Will nodded, his throat suddenly tight with emotion. Yes, that's exactly what we're building. Autumn deepened into winter, and winter yielded reluctantly to spring. Laramie transformed with the seasons growing and evolving as new businesses opened and old wounds healed. The territorial audit of Union Pacific operations continued under Maggie's meticulous oversight, revealing further corruption, but also establishing new protocols to prevent future abuses. Will's Forge prospered, expanding to include a small foundry capable of producing more complex metal components for the region's growing infrastructure needs. His reputation for quality work spread beyond Wyoming, bringing commissions from as far as Denver and Salt Lake City. Throughout these changes, Will and Maggie's courtship progressed with deliberate care. They attended social functions together, rode into the mountains on clear days, and spent quiet evenings discussing books and dreams. Each discovered in the other an unexpected complement, her precision balancing his intuition, his practicality grounding her ambition. On a perfect June morning, exactly 1 year after Maggie first stepped off the train in Laramie, Will waited nervously in the small church on Pine Street. Arthur Hargrove stood beside him as best man, offering quiet encouragement as the small building filled with well-wishers. "Breathe, man," Hargrove murmured. "You faced down Harrison Caldwell without flinching, but you're trembling like a leaf over a wedding." "Caldwell was trying to kill me," Will retorted. "Much simpler proposition," Hargrove chuckled. "Marriage is a different kind of bravery. the everyday kind that lasts a lifetime. Before Will could respond, the church door opened to admit Eleanor Whitney, resplendent in blue silk. She nodded to Will, then took her seat as the organist began the wedding march. Maggie appeared in his doorway, sunlight illuminating her like a vision. She wore not white, but a deep green that matched her eyes, adorned with delicate lace at collar and cuffs. No veil obscured her face. She had insisted on seeing clearly, and being clearly seen on this important day. She walked alone down the aisle, having declined all offers to be given away. As she explained to the scandalized wedding committee, "I'm not property to be transferred. I'm a woman making a choice." Now, watching her approach with steady grace and unwavering gaze, Will felt humbled by the strength of the woman who had chosen him. Not out of desperation or convenience, but with clear-eyed purpose and genuine love. When she reached him, Maggie extended her hand. Will took it, his damaged left hand clasping her right, imperfect, but fitting together perfectly. "Ready," she whispered. "For anything," he replied, "as long as we face it together." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They had written their own vows, promises, not of blind obedience or traditional roles, but of partnership respect and unwavering support. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was both a seal upon those promises and a pledge of all that was to come. The celebration afterward spread from the church to the town square, where tables groaned with food, and a platform had been erected for dancing. It seemed all of Laramie had turned out to celebrate not just a wedding, but a symbol of their town's rebirth after Caldwell's dark reign. As afternoon mellowed toward evening, Will found himself momentarily separated from Maggie, who was deep in conversation with the territorial governor and his wife. Watching her from across the square, confident, articulate, respected for her mind and character, filled him with quiet pride. "You chose well," came Eleanor's voice beside him. Or perhaps she chose well. Either way, it's a good match. "The best," Will agreed, "though I still sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't intervened that day at the station." Eleanor considered this. Harrison would have sent her back east immediately. He might have maintained his control a while longer. You might have remained alone with your forge and your memories. She shook her head. "Some moments are hinges, William. They open doors to entirely new futures." "And close others," Will said soberly, thinking of Caldwell's body in the dusty street, Tucker's suicide, the violence that had paved the way to this peaceful celebration. "Yes," Eleanor acknowledged, "but we can only walk through the doors before us, not the ones forever closed." She patted his arm. "And the path you and Maggie are starting down today, it's a good one." As the sun began to set, painting the distant mountains with gold and crimson, much like the day Maggie had returned to Laramie, Will found his bride again. They slipped away from the celebration, walking hand in hand toward their home, the expanded living quarters attached to the forge, now furnished with a careful blend of Will's practical pieces and items Maggie had shipped from Boston. "Happy?" Will asked, as they paused on the porch looking back toward town, where music and laughter still rose from the square. Maggie considered the question seriously, as she did all things. "Yes," she said finally. "Not in the simple way I might have imagined happiness once. It's deeper than that, more complex. Like a well-forged blade," Will suggested, "stronger for having been through fire." "Exactly," she smiled up at him. "We've both been shaped by difficult forces, Will, but here we are not, despite those forces, but because of how we faced them." Will drew her close, marveling as always at how perfectly she fit against him. "I never expected to find this again. After Catherine, after James, I thought that part of life was over for me." "And I never expected to find it at all," Maggie admitted. "With Robert, it was a practical arrangement that grew into affection. This," she gestured between them, "this caught me completely by surprise." "A pleasant surprise, I hope." "The best kind." She rose on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "Now, husband, shall we go inside? We have a future to begin building." As they crossed the threshold together, Will thought of all they had endured to reach this moment: deception and truth, violence and healing loss and discovery. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led here to this woman and this life he would have never dared imagine that cold day when she first stepped off the train. In the distance, the train whistle sounded the eastbound express departing for Cheyenne and beyond. But here in Laramie, William and Margaret Brennan were home at last, their shared horizon stretching endlessly before them.